Chapter 671. Los Angeles, USA. Mr. M.O., this is your cell phone number in China. It will take you a few days to get a new one in the United States. A middle-aged woman with blonde hair and blue eyes walked into the lounge and placed a light blue card on the table. Her Chinese was not very fluent. M.O. Jingshan had just returned to Los Angeles a few days ago. Less than 1 kilometer from the airport, he was ambushed by Akib's brother and his accomplices. During this period, the people of 11 Base had taken precautions in advance. Although there were no other problems or casualties, M.O. Jingshan's cell phone was left in the car before the car he was in spontaneously ignited, so his cell phone and the phone card he brought back were both destroyed. Jin Wan had registered a WeChat account for him with his cell phone number in China. It was impossible to get a new cell phone number in the United States in a few days, and M.O. Jingshan had just left 11 Base. When he got the phone card again, it was already the afternoon of the 6th day after he returned to the United States. Looking at the light blue card, M.O. Jingshan picked it up casually. At the same time, a man in black came into the lounge. The moment the man saw him, he walked over respectfully and cautiously. He looked Chinese but spoke fluent English. Mr. M.O., our boss is currently being held hostage by those people. They ask you to meet them at the appointed place alone, or they will kill him at any time. Seeing M.O. Jingshan still holding the card without saying anything, the middle-aged woman with blonde hair and blue eyes knew that he had something to talk about. She quickly stepped forward to open a spare cell phone on the table, inserted the phone card for him, and respectfully put it back in his hand. The man who had just come in was still talking, but M.O. Jingshan couldn't tell what his attitude was from his eyes, so he didn't dare to speak for a while. M.O. Jingshan casually turned on the cell phone he had just inserted the phone card into. Before he opened WeChat, another cell phone he often used in the United States rang. CEO M.O., Miss G is going to the United States with a partner to discuss a third-party project. The destination is Los Angeles. Shall we stay in High City or go to Los Angeles? M.O. Jingshan's eyes darkened. He glanced at the other phone, asking mildly, has she already boarded the plane? Yes, she just boarded the plane. We've checked everything. This flight is very safe, and there are no problems. However, High City is within the country after all, and the safety factor is much higher than overseas. She's going to Los Angeles this time purely for a project cooperation, but once she steps into the United States, we're afraid that those people lurking in the dark will shift their target to her. M.O. Jingshan didn't expect that Jin Wan would suddenly have a project in Los Angeles. This time, the Cambodian remnants' revenge operation involved both Los Angeles and Cambodia, and they didn't dare to extend their hands so far in China. However, as soon as Jin Wan stepped into Los Angeles, all the precautions he had arranged around her in High City would be useless. Send me her flight number and landing time. All right. A few minutes later, M.O. Jingshan hung up the phone and logged into the WeChat account that Jin Wan had helped him with on another phone. He immediately saw 2 messages she had sent him a few days ago, but the time shown was already a few days ago. Jin Wan took a nap on the plane. When she woke up, it was still 2 hours before they landed in Los Angeles. She got up, went to the first-class bathroom to wash her face, and then returned to her seat to chat with her business partner. 2 hours passed quickly. After flying all night, they finally landed at about 8:10 in the morning. Her business partner's client had arranged for someone to pick them up, but when Jin Wan walked out of the airport lobby while talking and laughing with her business partner, she saw a black SUV and M.O. Jingshan standing beside it. At first glance, she saw the man dressed in a black t-shirt and trousers, and then she saw him standing by the car door with one hand in his trouser pocket. It seemed that he had been waiting for a while. It took her a long time to come back to her senses. She took a look at the time, then at the other cars parked outside the airport lobby, and then at the handsome man next to the black SUV. Your friend is here to pick you up? The business partner walking with Jin Wan understood her look and asked with a smile. Jin Wan came back to herself and nodded at the business partner. They came here to talk about cooperation with a third-party company, but they didn't have to travel together. Seeing Jin Wan was picked up, the business partner greeted M.O. Jingshan politely. For some reason, he felt that M.O. Jingshan seemed familiar, but today M.O. Jingshan was not wearing a suit, and this business partner was a foreigner, so he was not sure who he was. After greeting him and nodding, he got into his own car and left. Jinwan still stood there, looking in Mo Jingshan's direction. It was not until the man standing by the car smiled at her that she came back to herself and walked over with her small suitcase. It's rare for CEO Mo to take time out of his busy schedule to pick me up. You don't even have time to make a phone call or reply to a message, but you still have time to come to the airport in person? Jinwan didn't ask too much. She just looked at the t-shirt he was wearing and felt that although he was very handsome, he was obviously not from the company. After all, he rarely dressed so casually in the company. You don't want to pick you up in person? Don't you want to take advantage of me? The man gave a faint smile. Jinwan chuckled. The question is, how did you know I would come to Los Angeles today? At the same time, without waiting for the man to answer, she immediately moved her eyebrows. Oh yes, I almost forgot. The bodyguards you arranged around me are also equivalent to spies. I have a little movement you can know. The man didn't refute and just took her small suitcase. Get in the car. Jinwan looked at him again, thought for a while and explained, I'm here to see a client. The bodyguards should have told you that I'm just here to talk about a third-party contract. I'll be back in 2 or 3 days. Okay. The man lowered his eyes, put her suitcase into the car, opened the door, and said again in a low voice, Get in the car first. Jinwan hesitated, walked to the car door, and insisted, So don't get me wrong. I'm not here to see you. Chapter 672. I haven't asked you anything yet. Why do you keep explaining? The man leaned down and gradually approached her with a deep smile in his eyes. Are you trying to hide something? Jinwan. She turned her head. Although I'm here for work, CEO Mo is so busy that he doesn't even reply to my messages. So I came here to see how busy you are. Mo Jingshan chuckled and gently stroked her head. A few days ago, I accidentally lost my cell phone in China, so I couldn't get a new number card. I couldn't log in to other numbers, so I didn't see it. I didn't get it back until this morning. Jinwan couldn't help looking at him. You actually lost something? Did someone steal your phone, or did you accidentally drop it somewhere? The man didn't answer but said slowly in a low voice, When will you start working? I'll send someone to accompany you. It's not safe in Los Angeles these days, so I'll send 2 people from Nanheng's place to accompany you. Jinwan thought he meant it wasn't safe because she had seen it on the international news a few days ago. It was said that recently in Los Angeles, there had been some gangs and gangsters causing trouble. There were frequent confrontations between the police and those people. This matter had already been reported on the international news for several days. Usually, similar situations would also occur in other cities in America. She was already used to it. He wanted to arrange people from 11 Base to accompany her, so she didn't refuse. She just nodded and said, Don't trouble them too much. I heard that Feng Ling hasn't been in Los Angeles for a long time. Otherwise, I would have met her. Speaking of this, Jinwan remembered something and said, Before I came, I booked a hotel in the downtown business district. Check out of the hotel. With that, the man closed the car door for her. Jinwan took a look at the time. When the man walked around the car and got into the car, she turned to look at the man who sat in the driver's seat. The hotel is very close to the place where I'm negotiating with my partners. Then check out of the hotel and live at my place. Jinwan couldn't explain her feelings, but she felt that the man's attitude was particularly firm today. For example, he suddenly came to pick her up, arranged for someone to accompany her, and asked her to stay at his place. Los Angeles was very big. If she didn't stay in a hotel, she would have to take a detour to discuss the project. However, since he said that he would arrange people around her, she couldn't make them go to the hotel to find her. After thinking about it, she didn't say anything more. This time, I came to the United States to find a third party to cooperate with. I heard that the other party is a very punctual person. It's best to arrive in advance at the agreed time. It'd be best if the person you plan to put with me has a car. If not, I'll book a car in advance and ask someone to drive over. I'll arrange everything for you. Don't worry, just follow me. Where are you going with me? Your company? The Mo family in Los Angeles? Or your apartment in Los Angeles. It's a hotel too. Jean Wan immediately turned to look at the man's handsome side profile as he drove. Hotel? Why have you been staying in a hotel since you returned to the United States? The man didn't explain but said indifferently, I have some temporary arrangements. The hotel is not far from the city center, but it can guarantee that you will be sent there on time before you meet the partner. Don't worry, En. Logically speaking, Mo Jingshan returned to the United States because of the company. He had a place to live in the company, and he should have a place to live near the company. Besides, the Mo family in Los Angeles was not far from the headquarters of the Shine Group, but he was staying in a hotel. Jean Wan didn't ask much. After a moment of confusion, she turned to look out of the window, saying, Since it's a hotel, please arrange another room for me. Mo Jingshan didn't answer. When they drove to the airport freeway, there was a traffic jam at the intersection ahead because of the car accident. The man slowed down the car and stopped behind a car. Then he put his arm around her waist, brought her into his arms, and let her sit on his lap. This was the airport freeway. Even if there was a traffic jam, they might have to drive forward at any time. Jean Wan struggled, but the man held her waist. The man pressed his thin lips against her white, soft cheek and said hoarsely, It's rare for you to come to Los Angeles for a few days. Stay in front of me. Don't think about hiding too far away, and don't think about living in other rooms. There is enough office space and sleeping space in my suite. You're unhappy because I didn't reply to your message, which shows that you still care about me. Since you're here, there's no need to keep a distance. I didn't say to keep a distance, but we don't have to live together. Jean Wan tried to avoid him. Anyway, I don't want to live in your room. Besides, you have a job in the United States, and so do I. No matter how big the suite is, we can still hear each other's voices. If I suddenly appear on the screen when you are working through a video call, it doesn't seem good. Why not? Do you think there are still people who don't know that you are Mrs. Mo? After all, Mo Jingshan was the head of Shine Group. Even if it was news about him in China, it was likely that some media in the United States would also forward and expose it. Therefore, when Mo Jingshan said in front of the media that they were not divorced, many people in the United States probably knew about it, especially the people in his company. Mo Jingshan, I find that you are really a clear-headed, shrewd, and ruthless person. I admit that I'm clear-headed, but what do you mean by ruthless? The more clear-headed and calm a person is, the more ruthless he is, isn't he, Mo Jingshan? When have I ever been ruthless to you? The only time I treated you coldly was 3 years ago, and all of it was for your own good. He pressed his forehead against hers, and his masculine breath lingered in her nose, filling her sense of smell. Think about it. What have I done to you? And no matter what, you should tell me instead of doing it yourself. I'm not a child. I shouldn't be the last to know anything. Before coming to Los Angeles this time, Jean Wan had thought that she should put many things on the table and have a good talk with him. Just because I often bear the responsibility for you without you knowing, I am accused of being ruthless? Jean Wan reached out to push his arm. I didn't say it was a crime. I just suddenly thought of it, so I said it. We have to keep driving. Let go of me first. Sit on my lap. Don't twist around. It's easy for you to get into trouble like this. Jean Wan. How could he be so indecent in a traffic jam on the highway? If she went to live with him now, she would basically be a sheep walking into a tiger's mouth. At this time, the engines of the cars blocked in front of them had been restarted. It seemed that they had dispersed and were ready to drive again. Chapter 673. Mo Jingshan raised her chin with his fingers. Seeing that she was obviously going to talk to him but was holding back her anger, he chuckled. Let's talk when we get back. Don't lose your temper. Then let go of me first. After all, they were on the highway, so he didn't force her face. He just kissed her on the cheek, let go of her, and let her sit back in the passenger seat. They returned to the hotel Mo Jingshan mentioned. As expected, he didn't book another room for her. After entering his room, she found that it was a business suite of more than 200 square meters, which was basically as big as a normal 3-bedroom apartment. There was a large study, 2 large separate bedrooms, and a living room which was enough for 2 people to live in. Even when he was working, Jin-won wouldn't disturb him by making a phone call in the bedroom next door. After entering the room and sitting down, Jin-won said, "This hotel seems to be very close to 11 base. What's going on? Did something happen to Nanhung? Otherwise, why didn't you live in the company but here?" Mo Jingshin asked the hotel staff to bring in a glass of juice, put the juice on the coffee table for her, and said indifferently, "Recently, there is indeed something that needs Nanhang's attention, but it's just a small matter. After dealing with it, he will go back to the company. You don't have to worry about it. Just focus on your work. Don't walk alone at any time." Jin-won held the glass and looked at the pale green strange juice with fresh milk in it. With CEO Mo's ability, it must not be a small matter that hasn't been dealt with after so many days after returning to the United States. "You let me live here. Are you afraid that I will be in danger?" Besides, he had repeatedly told her not to walk alone and try not to leave his sight. And now it was so close to 11 base. If that was the case, some memories from 3 years ago suddenly leaped into her mind. For a moment, Jin-won suddenly rejoiced that she had come to America. At least she could see him safe and sound in front of her, instead of leaving him in Cambodia like in the past. She almost couldn't see him for the rest of her life. Thinking of this, Jin-won frowned. "Well, Shine Group is yours after all. You are the one in charge. Who can restrict your whereabouts? If there was anything urgent that your subordinates needed you to deal with, they would most likely fly to High City, but this time you suddenly returned to Los Angeles without warning. Could it be that you didn't come back because of the company in the US, but because of something else?" Mo Jingshin looked at her for a moment and then smiled at her. "You really dare to think of anything. I can see how sensitive you are to Los Angeles. Don't change the subject." He smiled. "There are indeed some things that need to be dealt with, but it's not as serious as you think. As long as you settle the work here as soon as possible and return to High City safely in 2 or 3 days, you don't have to worry about anything else." Jin-won glared at him. "What did I say after I got off the plane?" "Mo Jingshin, if there is anything, I hope you can tell me, instead of bearing it unilaterally. It's not a good feeling to be kept in the dark. If it happens again, I won't forgive you." Mo Jingshin unhurriedly put her small suitcase aside. "You didn't eat or sleep well on the plane. What do you want to eat now? I'll ask the hotel to make it for you. I'm talking to you nicely. Why do you act as if nothing happened?" "Mo Jingshin, are you breaking the rules? If I don't treat you nicely, I won't be surnamed." Mo Jingshin glanced at her. "What's the rule of the Cold War between us?" Jin-won. She didn't want to have a Cold War. Before she came to the US, she had already ordered the blue diamond he gave her to have it custom-made. Although she was reluctant to admit it, she did want to solve the problem. After all, if they hadn't divorced, she couldn't always avoid it. Jin-won thought for a while and said, "No matter why you came back to the US this time, even if you can't use your domestic number in WeChat, you should at least call me, but you didn't do anything, which means you didn't tell me something. But as soon as you heard the news that I came to the US, you went to pick me up, which means you care about my safety. Since I set foot on the land of Los Angeles, I have become one of your burdens again, but you don't want to affect my work, nor do you want to misunderstand my purpose of coming here, so you still don't say anything. So, Mo Jingshin, I said that you are always clear-headed and cold, and I didn't wrong you at all." The man interrupted her with a smile. "I'll only make you more worried. After all, you were terrified of Cambodia. If I told you, I'm afraid you would have flown to the US a few days ago. The only thing I miscalculated is that you have a job in Los Angeles recently." Jin-won looked at him. "Cambodia? Yes. Haven't those people been wiped out by 11 base and the local police, including the police in the US? Akib has a younger brother who used to wander around Africa and war-torn countries. Over the years, the power he built up in the dark was no worse than his brother's. Back then, those arms dealers had a lot of connections with Akib's family. This involved a lot of people, causing Akib's younger brother to use the excuse of avenging his brother to sneak into Los Angeles to take away what his brother couldn't get from me." Jin-won's eyes were calm, but her hand slowly clenched the cup. She didn't have a deep impression of what happened that year. After all, what happened in Cambodia at that time was a matter of life and death every minute and second. At that time, her only belief was to save Mo Jingshan, to give him food and water, and to keep him alive. She vaguely remembered hearing someone say that Akib and Dali were trying to get some underground arms trading channels from Mo Jingshan's mouth. As long as Mo Jingshan gave in, they would gain billions of dollars of profits overnight. Underground businesses were often linked to all kinds of dirty or even illegal interests, but these interests were very huge. In this case, this so-called Akib's younger brother was after Mo Jingshan. So this is why you returned to the US this time? Mo Jingshan was calm. After knowing the truth, you began to worry? Chapter 674. Who liked to have a cold war with him? Most of the time, it was nothing more than unwillingness and pride. Someone knocked on the door to ask for Mo Jingshan. Seeing that he had gone out, Jin Wan packed her luggage in the room alone. Half an hour later, Mo Jingshan returned to the room, only to see that Jin Wan's luggage had been placed in one of the bedrooms, and Jin Wan had fallen asleep on the sofa because she had been on the plane for too long and had been waiting for him on the sofa for too long. Mo Jingshan bent down to pick up the phone she had dropped on the carpet. He picked her up and gently placed her on the bed. He pulled the covers over her and pushed the woman's hair away from the pillow. After watching her for a moment, he turned and walked out of the bedroom with long strides. In the living room of the hotel suite, Mo Jingshan opened the floor-to-ceiling window, walked to the European-style railing of the balcony, looked at the vast lawn, took out his vibrating cell phone, and picked it up deadpan. The other party's voice soon rang. CEO Mo, have you found it? Yes, I found it. The so-called third party in Los Angeles who contacted MN Group is the head of a financial investment company bought by Akib's brother, Atuda. Their purpose is to lure Miss G to the United States without arousing her suspicion, because the third party they contacted has indeed maintained a long-term cooperative relationship with the head of that financial investment company, and also has a cooperative relationship with MN Group, so it's reasonable to introduce a third party to them. They can't do anything in China, and they know that Miss G is your weakness. There's no other way to make her lower her guard except to lure her to Los Angeles through normal business negotiations. And they know that since you have returned to Los Angeles, Miss G will definitely come to Los Angeles because of this third-party cooperation. Mo Jingshan's eyes fell on the lawn in the distance, and there was coldness and sternness in his eyes. He put one hand on the railing of the balcony and said coldly, "Spread the news to her business partner that the financial investment company closed down a week ago, and all cooperation projects are in a shelved and buffer period. Anyone who participates in cooperation with them at this stage will definitely lose money. Tell him to give up the idea of discussing a third-party cooperation with Jin Wan. Let him come forward and interrupt this negotiation. Don't give them a chance to get close to Jin Wan." "All right," the man said coldly. "By the way, the financial company that has dealings with Atuda can really go bankrupt. It will never have the chance to establish itself in the financial investment industry again." "Understood. Then Miss G's special trip to the United States to cooperate with us has fallen through just like this." Mo Jingshan placed one hand on the railing and casually tapped on it with his slender fingers. The cold wind blew toward the lawn in the distance. It doesn't matter if it's a financial investor or a business partner that has connections with MN Group. Find a company that will allow her to continue working with a third party. Don't let her make this trip in vain. After the discussion, send her back to High City immediately. The person on the other side of the phone said awkwardly, "Although it's easy to find a third-party company of the same level, I'm afraid we can't let Miss G return to High City after the discussion. After all, you're here. Whether she leaves or not, isn't it still up to you, CEO Mo?" "Really?" Mo Jingshan was unperturbed. "Then I'll personally send her back to High City, Nanhung, and you can handle everything in Los Angeles." The person on the other side of the phone wanted to cry but had no tears. "We'll find a way to make Miss G's work go smoothly and let her return to High City without worry. She won't stay in the United States for too long." "Okay, go ahead." After hanging up the phone, Mo Jingshan took a look at the room where Jin Wan was sleeping. Atuda was too purposeful. In order to get the clues from him, he really wanted Jin Wan. Knowing that Jin Wan was in China and they couldn't do anything to her, they tried to lure her to the United States under the pretext of company cooperation. It didn't matter if he told her in advance how dangerous the situation was. At least in this case, she knew how to protect herself better. Jin Wan woke up after a while. After all, it was not dark yet. Just now, she suddenly fell asleep while waiting on the sofa. She got up to wash her face. When she came out, she found that the man was reading work emails on her computer. Mo Jingshin, MN Group and Shine Group are not the same company. Are you stealing business secrets by reading emails on my computer? Looking at the man's calm and composed back, Jin Wan walked over. Mo Jingshin casually clicked open another of her emails. Without turning his head, he gently and indifferently said, "If I didn't read your work emails, I wouldn't have known that those messy, weak, small companies are all eyeing MN Group. Right now, you're really a piece of fat meat in their mouths." Jin Wan. After all, MN Group has just moved back to China, and we can't miss many cooperation projects. Although I receive a lot of emails and messages from other companies, I can't cooperate with just anyone. I'm just spreading my net widely. Although MN Group has a good reputation in the Chinese community, compared with Shine, it's still not as good as Shine. I can't be like Shine, which doesn't even take a look at companies that are not strong enough. He smiled. "Don't you want to sleep a little longer?" Jin Wan walked over and saw that he had deleted the useless emails in her mailbox. In fact, several small companies in the United States had contacted her, but she had ignored them. She had planned to visit them in person after coming to the United States, but in the blink of an eye, they were deleted by Mo Jingshin. Jin Wan's cheeks immediately puffed up. She reached out to grab her computer. "You can read them, but you actually deleted my emails." The man tilted his head to look at her. "It's useless. There's no need to visit these small companies. You'd better stay here for the next few days and don't go anywhere. Don't contact these small companies." Jin Wan casually flipped through it and saw that he had deleted some emails, but they were indeed documents sent by small companies that even she didn't like and didn't need to see. She sat down by his side and casually clicked on the computer. "Do you think you can erase the crime of stealing MN Group's business secrets by doing this? As the dignified CEO of Shine, you used my computer to read my company's emails. How on earth did you crack my computer password?" He smiled. "It's the same password as your phone. Do I need to crack it?" Dash. Chapter 675. After a while, Jin Wan turned off the computer and said, "Mo Jingshin, and I'm still considering whether to meet the business partner I'm going to meet in the United States. I came here to talk to him, but after thinking about it carefully, I feel it's too much of a coincidence. I feel that the timing and reason of the financial company's olive branch to us are a bit far-fetched." But then Jin Wan said gloomily, "But I'm already here. It's not appropriate for me to meet him." Mo Jingshin took a look at her and said with a smile, "It's not too late for you to be vigilant." Jin Wan raised her eyebrows and looked at him. "Is that company really related to Akib's brother? I was there when they were in Cambodia. If they investigate, they will definitely find me. They want to do something to me, don't they?" At first, Jin Wan was wondering how Mo Jingshin was going to solve this problem, but she didn't think anything would happen. At most, he wouldn't be able to return to High City for the time being. However, when she slept just now, she dreamed of a lot of things that happened in Cambodia 3 years ago, and now she felt a little scared. She heard that Akib's brother lived in war-torn countries all year round. He was probably even more ruthless than his brother and would not give up until he achieved his goal. Then I don't have to meet the people of that company anymore. Jin Wan was silent for a moment and then said, "In case something really happens, I've arranged another good company for you. The third-party cooperation that you want to expand with other partners in the same industry can be successfully negotiated. You can talk to the people and companies that I've arranged. As for the others, you don't have to touch them." Jin Wan raised her eyebrows. "You arranged someone else for me?" The man looked back, took the computer in her arms, and said lightly, "I can't let you come here for nothing." What did he mean by coming here for nothing? This was because after she came out of the airport, She insisted that she only came to the United States to work, not to look for him. So even if there was a change in the work that was originally arranged, he could still let her continue to do it step by step. Was he personally laying a path for her to step down? Then I'll meet the partner you arranged. Based on Mo Jingshan's experience, the person he arranged would definitely be much more reliable than the person she was supposed to meet. Furthermore, the success rate of their discussion and cooperation would be much smoother. Okay, I'll give you their contact information later. Jin Wan had no objection and nodded. Mo Jingshan looked at the email on her computer again. Because of Jin Wan's trust and cooperation, as well as the fact that she obediently listened to his arrangements after learning of the danger, his lips curved into a smile. In the evening, they had dinner in the hotel. After Mo Jingshan talked with the people from 11 Base, Jin Wan followed him downstairs and the two had dinner together. The people from 11 Base still had an impression of Jin Wan, especially Kay and the others, who were very kind to her when they saw her and called her Mrs. Mo or sister-in-law. All this fate originated from the food Jin Wan cooked for them and the socks she washed for them in Cambodia. Speaking of which, she didn't know how Fong Ling and Nan Hung were now. After Nan Hung went to the UK to take Fong Ling away, Jin Wan had been busy with her career. She occasionally called Fong Ling, but Fong Ling didn't like to express her happiness or unhappiness to her good friends like Xia Tian, nor did she deliberately mention her relationship to ask her good friends for help. She never talked about herself. Fong Ling was quiet and feminine in front of Jin Wan, but most of the time, as Kay described, she was a very cold and very cool woman. She was good at fighting and fickle, but Nan Hung was deeply poisoned by her and couldn't get rid of her no matter how hard he tried. However, when they had dinner in the evening, when the people from 11 Base saw Jin Wan sitting at the same table as Mo Jingshan, they all looked surprised. Oh, it turned out that Mrs. Mo and Mr. Mo were a family. It seemed that the divorce they had heard was false. As soon as this conclusion came out, these people called her Mrs. Mo and sister-in-law more affectionately. In fact, Jin Wan didn't know how to explain. After being called like this so many times, she simply didn't bother to explain. Anyway, they wouldn't listen to her even if she explained. The next day, before noon, the business partner Mo Jingshan arranged for her was already waiting at the appointed place. Jin Wan contacted her business partner who came to Los Angeles with her, and after setting the time, she was going to go there. Mo Jingshan couldn't leave, so he had 4 good men from 11 Base drive to follow her. On the way, Jin Wan was still talking on the phone, when she suddenly saw the little brother who was driving look back through the rearview mirror and then speed up the car coldly. Jin Wan subconsciously looked back, only to find that several black cars had been following them for a while without her noticing. She put down the phone and asked, "Are they those people? Are they Akib's brother's men?" The driver didn't expect Jin Wan to know, and immediately took a look at her through the rearview mirror. "Yes, that man's name is Atuda. He's very difficult to deal with. Mrs. Mo, sit tight. I'm probably going to start racing when we reach the road ahead." Jin Wan casually fastened the seat belt on the back seat. "Okay, sit tight." The driver immediately stepped harder on the accelerator. When he turned into the road ahead where there were fewer cars, he accelerated the car to more than 200 kilometers per hour. It was indeed the kind of racing speed that could only be seen in movies. The passing buildings and scenery outside the car window flashed by so quickly that she couldn't see them clearly at all. Jin Wan kept looking ahead at the speed displayed on the driver's seat and didn't look nervous at all. She knew there would be no problem with the people sent by Mo Jingshan. After about 10 minutes, the cars behind them also accelerated. Although they didn't get rid of them, they at least kept a safe distance from them. If they wanted to shoot here, they wouldn't hit this car. It wasn't until the car gradually slowed down that Jin Wan took a look back, only to find that several SUVs had just rushed out of the intersection on both sides and successfully stopped the unknown cars behind them. A lot of people got out of the SUVs, and Jin Wan could tell from their clothes that they were from 11 Base. The car continued to move forward. After a while, the driver saw that Jin Wan's face didn't change, looked at her through the rearview mirror, and smiled. "Mrs. Mo, aren't you afraid?" Chapter 676. The driver immediately smiled and looked a little silly. "That's true. Mrs. Mo, don't worry. I promise I'll make sure you finish your work today. It doesn't matter whether you can finish it or not. Just be careful. If you can't finish it, you can go back so as not to get involved in other trouble. Jean Wan didn't expect that those people would chase the car on the road, and now she didn't want to trouble them too much because of her work. It's okay. Mr. Mo has arranged everything. It will be very safe all the way. We have people at the appointed place. The driver said, quickly turned to another intersection, and went straight in the direction of the destination. After arriving, Jean Wan didn't expect that the partner Mo Jingshan arranged for her was an old acquaintance she had met in England. At that time, the other party was passing by London, England, and she didn't have a better project to cooperate with him, so unfortunately, they didn't cooperate. Unexpectedly, Jean Wan's MN Group had moved back to China. This company had a lot of projects in the United States and High City. As soon as he saw Jean Wan, he talked about his regrets in London. However, after 2 or 3 hours, Jean Wan not only successfully negotiated the contract and several cooperation plans, but also directly turned the third-party cooperation into a direct cooperation between the two parties. The other party also introduced other friends to cooperate with the third party. In short, she gained a lot and also made up for the regret that she failed to sign the project in London. Finally, before leaving, they chatted happily. When she returned to the car to go back, Jean Wan looked through the plan she had just drawn up together and recalled the scene when she sat together and talked with the several partners just now. It went so well, and it could be said that she had fulfilled a little wish when she was in London. She really wondered if there was anything that Mo Jingshan couldn't predict or do. He just wanted to help her find a partner so that she wouldn't come to Los Angeles in vain, but it turned out that everything was just what she wanted. Jean Wan was carefully reading the plan in her hand when the driver's cell phone rang. She raised her eyes and looked at the driver's seat. The other party put on the headset to answer the phone. She could only hear him calmly and solemnly respond, but she didn't know what he said. But then she noticed that the car had changed its direction. It took several strange roads and took a detour for about 20 minutes before it returned to the main road leading to the hotel near 11 Base. She guessed that she was probably being followed, but seeing that the driver was very calm, she continued to read the plan in her hand. After returning to the hotel, the bodyguard still followed her until they sent her back to her room and left 2 people to guard outside. Although no one clearly told her the seriousness of the situation, she could see the seriousness of the situation from the process of going out and coming back, as well as the situation of these people guarding and following her. She could see the seriousness of the situation. Jean Wan didn't come out after returning to her room, but she didn't see Mo Jingshan after coming back in the afternoon. Even when it was dark, Mo Jingshan still didn't come back. She took a shower and walked back and forth in the room. She didn't use a hairdryer to dry her hair, but when her hair dried naturally, it was already 11 o'clock at night in Los Angeles time, and Mo Jingshan still didn't come back. This suite was very large. Jean Wan looked at the time from time to time, then pushed open the floor-to-ceiling windows on the balcony and looked out. The lawn outside the hotel was also beautifully lit. The whole hotel was very luxurious and brightly lit. Because this place was in the suburbs, there were not many buildings in front of her, and all she could see were lawns or roads. But from this angle, she seemed to see the lights of Los Angeles in the distance. A familiar worry and anxiety troubled her. Just like when Mo Jingshan disappeared in Cambodia 3 years ago. She finally understood why Mo Jingshan asked her not to be guarded by the bodyguards he sent or to stay in front of him and not to leave his sight. Because in such a place, under such circumstances, she could only feel at ease when the person she cared about was in front of her. Jean Wan stood on the balcony for a while, but she didn't see Mo Jingshan's car coming back, so she turned back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She really couldn't sleep, so she picked up the cooperation plan during the day and went into the study of the suite, planning to finish this part of the work before tomorrow morning. It was 12 o'clock at night, and the lights in the study were still on. Jean Wan had read the last few pages of the cooperation plan. When she turned back, she was about to get up and pour herself a glass of water when she suddenly saw a handsome and tall man standing in the shadow of the study door. Mo Jingshan put one hand in the trouser pocket of his trousers and leaned his tall body slightly against the wall by the door. His handsome face was hidden in the darkness of the study, but she could still see his incomparably cold outline. He was looking at her as if he had been standing there watching her since he came back. Jean Wan paused and suddenly looked at the time. It was already past 12 o'clock at night. She had been waiting for him to come back, but she was so focused on her work that she didn't even notice when he entered the room. But she noticed that Mo Jingshin was wearing a suit today instead of the t-shirt he wore yesterday, so she subconsciously asked, "Did you go to the company today?" The man still stood there and looked at her with a faint smile. "Have you finished your work? It's just a cooperation plan. I can finish it after I return to High City. There's no hurry. I just couldn't sleep, so I opened it to have a look," Jean Wan said as she walked out. When she came to Mo Jingshin's side, she wanted to brush past him, but she suddenly stopped and turned to look at the man who had been leaning against the wall indifferently and looking at her deeply. Why did you come back so late today? Did something happen?" The man's elegant and deep brows moved slightly. "Are you concerned about me?" Jean Wan didn't hesitate and answered, "I can't really be an ingrate." Mo Jingshin looked at her, and the slight smile on his lips couldn't hide his elegance and indifference. "The company had some temporary arrangements today. I went back to the company to deal with some things and went to a dinner party in the evening, so I came back a little late. Couldn't you send me a message or call me in advance if you had a dinner party?" Chapter 677. Mo Jingshin saw that although the little woman did not say anything, it was clear from her eyes that she had been worried all night. Just as Jean Wan was about to walk past him, Mo Jingshin held her waist and pulled her into his arms. Being pressed by his arm, Jean Wan was suddenly pressed against the wall, and she was pressed against him tightly. She rushed to step back, but the man held her waist and refused to let go. At the same time, he chuckled lowly. "I thought you didn't care, so I didn't say anything, lest you rebuke me if I did." The man who had the ability to control the trajectory of her life was now trying to play the trick of suffering in front of her. Did he think she didn't care? She really didn't care. She didn't care at all. But no matter how she struggled, she couldn't break free. The man held her and seemed to be very satisfied with her embarrassed look. He bent down and kissed her cheek. As if it was not enough, he kissed her again. When Jean Wan was so angry that she wanted to bite him, the man smiled and kissed her hairline when she lowered her head. Jean Wan trembled all over and glared at him. "Mo Jingshin, you? Admit it, Mrs. Mo, you still love me." Jean Wan put on a straight face. "Who wants to talk about love with you? Haven't you already arranged a plane ticket back to High City for me tomorrow? I'll go back tomorrow. I don't care if you live or die in the United States." The man chuckled. "Going back to High City as soon as possible will make me feel more at ease. Los Angeles is not suitable for you recently. If you want to come back later, I'll take you here in person, en?" Who cared? Jean Wan twisted again but still couldn't move away. The man leaned against the wall and held her in his arms. He looked pleased and content, imprisoning her in his arms as if it didn't take him any effort at all. She struggled for a while, but in the end, she had no choice but to lean into his arms. Looking at the man's face so close to hers and the gratified and satisfied smile in his eyes, her heart moved slightly. In the end, she gradually calmed down and allowed him to hold her. After a long while, she blurted out, "Do I have to go back to High City tomorrow?" The man's low, magnetic voice was right by her ear. "Why? You can't bear to go back? Knowing that you're not safe in Los Angeles, I'm afraid I won't be able to feel at ease if I leave alone." However, she hadn't been able to sleep well since he hadn't returned for a few hours. If she didn't receive any news from him after returning to High City, she might not be able to stay in High City anymore. She might find a way to fly over at any time. But she knew that she couldn't do anything here. She was involved in different fields from 11 Base and Nanhang, so even if she stayed, it seemed that she could only be protected by his people. Not only would she take up their manpower, but she might also be a burden to him. Returning to Sea City was indeed the most reassuring and least burdensome way for him. But after returning, what if he didn't reply when she sent him another message or didn't pick up the call? What should she do? He was afraid that he would be unable to control his imagination. As long as you return to High City obediently, I promise that I'll be back safe and sound within half a month. The man patted her back. Trust me. Of course, Jean-Wan believed him, but she didn't expect these things before coming to Los Angeles. Now, according to the original plan, she would return to High City in 2 or 3 days. But now she suddenly didn't want to leave. But she had to go. She lowered her head, no longer retreating or struggling, but rested her head on the man's shoulder and said with her eyes closed, "Mo Jingshin. In fact, there's nothing wrong with sharing joys and sorrows. You don't have to always protect me behind you. I can do a lot of things for you, but the one thing I don't want is to become your weakness." But she knew that she was still his weakness. So no matter what, he had to take her back to a safe place and not allow her to step into danger. Mo Jingshin almost unconsciously raised his hand and placed it on her head. After holding her for a long time, he pressed his lips against her hair to ask softly, 3 years ago, when I woke up in the Los Angeles hospital, I read the dozens of messages you sent me. Jean-Wan didn't speak but closed her eyes. One of the messages said that you loved me. Mo Jingshin's voice was very low and light, and his tone was a bit profound. So, take back your words that you don't love me anymore. You are mine, and your heart can only be mine. Don't run too far away. Come back when you have to. Jean-Wan still didn't speak. The assistant by your side, Xiao Ba, said that in your first year in London, you would often run to open the door when you heard movements outside. You would then stare blankly at the empty space outside. Mo Jingshin asked softly, "Were you waiting for me?" Mo Jingshin had thought that Jean-Wan would hate him, blame him, and perhaps never forgive him. But since he learned what happened to her in the first year she arrived in London, he was completely relieved. No matter how heartless her words were, or how serious and cold she pretended to be, he didn't believe that she really didn't love him when she said she didn't love him anymore. Jean-Wan didn't speak, just being held by the man for a long time. She suddenly took a deep breath, buried her head in his arms, and whispered, "Mo Jingshin, after returning to High City, let's go back to the U Garden. I want to see what the U Garden looks like after you refurbished it." All right. The next morning, Jean-Wan was sent to the airport on time, ready to return to High City. Mo Jingshin sent the little brother who drove yesterday to see her off, and 2 bodyguards followed her at the airport. After passing the security check and entering the departure hall, Jean-Wan learned that the little brother who drove the car would accompany her back to High City and would not leave until he was sure she was safely back in High City. The other 2 bodyguards didn't follow her in but waited outside the security check, waiting for her plane to take off. In the first-class waiting room, the little brother had been standing by her side obediently and had never left. All the people passing by or pedestrians she saw were ordinary people who were carrying suitcases and preparing to go out on the same flight, so the safety factor was very high. She didn't see Atuda's men even when she boarded the plane. Jean-Wan didn't have much luggage, but after all, there was a laptop in it, so it was a little heavy. When she boarded the plane, the little brother walked in front of her, ready to help her put her luggage in first, and Jean-Wan followed him. Behind her, the people who were also boarding the plane were lining up in order. After boarding the plane, Jean-Wan saw that the first-class bathroom was not closed. She happened to accidentally spill juice on her hand in the departure lounge, so she turned to go in and wash her hands before going back to sit down. As soon as she stepped into the bathroom in this cabin, the door behind her was suddenly closed. It was not spacious here, and Jean-Wan found that there was a person in this narrow space. She raised her eyes abruptly. Chapter 678. The black SUV sped on the road. At this time, Jean-Wan should have boarded the plane and would arrive in High City at night. He didn't have time to go to the airport in person for the first hour. He had just received news from Nanhang that the partner of Shine Group who had been kidnapped by Atuda for 2 days had been successfully rescued. Mo Jingshin hurried to the airport. Even though he knew that she had boarded the plane, Los Angeles was different from other places. Anything could happen here. He couldn't rest assured until he confirmed that she had boarded the plane with his own eyes and that the plane had taken off. As the black SUV sped on, his cell phone suddenly rang. He glanced at the number on the screen and suddenly felt uneasy. His usually restrained calmness was suddenly affected by unknown turbulence. He picked up the phone and listened to the urgent report from the man who had been sent to escort Jinwan back to High City. The black SUV continued to move forward. Mo Jingshan slowed down the car, held the steering wheel with one hand, and dialed Jinwan's number with the other. However, her cell phone was turned off. Her cell phone was fully charged before she boarded the plane. Couldn't be out of battery now. He called her again, but her cell phone was still turned off. Mo Jingshan's eyes darkened. He was sure that Jinwan had suddenly disappeared a few minutes after boarding the plane. If Atuda had also planted spies among the staff of Los Angeles Airport, he was afraid that all the staff on the plane had been controlled. Mo Jingshan dialed Jinwan's number again and again, but her cell phone was turned off every time, which made his heart sink. The car sped up and sped toward the airport at a terrible speed. Finally, he arrived at the airport. However, when he got off the car, his cell phone suddenly rang. The moment he picked up the phone, Nan Heng's voice rang. I don't know how Atuda got through to all the flights from Los Angeles to High City these days. They failed to find Jinwan's flight, but I'm afraid he has planted spies on all the flights these days, hiding in the cabins, ready to take Jinwan away at any time. They know that only Jinwan can threaten you, so they have no intention of letting her return to High City. I just got the news. Has Jinwan boarded the plane? Is it too late? When Mo Jingshan answered the phone, he saw the 3 bodyguards coming out of the airport but didn't see Jinwan. His rare fluke was instantly shattered by reality. It was a rare sandstorm in Los Angeles. The strong winds and the yellow soil that came from nowhere seemed to have dyed the whole world yellow. The weather was foggy, and the air pressure was low until the sky gradually darkened. The people they sent out didn't receive any news from Jinwan. Mo Jingshan stood by the window. The people behind him were all quiet. No one dared to say a word. They were all anxiously waiting for news from the others. Looking at the sky full of yellow sand, Mo Jingshan's heart seemed to be empty. His mind was filled with the image of Jinwan leaning softly in his arms last night. After 3 years, she finally softened her whole body and whispered in his arms that she would return to the U Garden after he returned to High City. Her eyes were filled with faint anticipation. Mr. Mo, Atuda's men are very secretive today. They know how important Mrs. Mo is. Now that they have succeeded, I'm afraid they are deliberately wasting our time and energy. Kay, who had just returned from outside, walked in quickly. Mo Jingshan dropped the cell phone in his hand and raised his hand to touch between his eyebrows. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't rub the deeper frown between his eyebrows. Suddenly, the cell phone he had just thrown on the table rang. The sudden noise made Mo Jingshan freeze. He turned to look at the number displayed on the screen. It was Jinwan's cell phone number. Mo Jingshan's eyes darkened. He had guessed something. He picked up the cell phone and put it to his ear. Before the other party spoke, he said coldly, "Tell me your conditions. Don't hurt her." "Oh, Mr. Control, you're really smart. You haven't even heard my voice, but you've already guessed it." It was a similarly deep, cold, and slightly hoarse voice. There was a hint of the vicissitudes and profoundness that came from being stimulated by the smoke of gunpowder in the war-torn lands. Hearing that it was Atuda's voice, Mo Jingshan's face suddenly became much colder. For many days, it was his men who came out to do things. It was rare for him to do it in person, but he directly put his hands on Jinwan. However, Atuda had always been ruthless, and those who were targeted by him wouldn't be treated well. "Atuda, this is Los Angeles, not your territory in Cambodia. I warn you not to act rashly. If my people lose even a hair, I'll let you know the price." Mo Jingshan held the phone deadpan and looked coldly at the yellow sand outside. "Of course I know this is Los Angeles. If it wasn't Los Angeles, do you think I would threaten you by kidnapping your woman?" The man on the other side of the phone sneered. As he spoke, he turned his eyes to Jinwan, who was slowly waking up in a corner of the dark warehouse, and said coldly, "Oh, your woman has woken up. She's not bad. She's so beautiful that I'm surprised." I didn't expect that you had such a beautiful wife but didn't find her for 3 years. She appeared in Cambodia and even shot a keb in the back, didn't she? Mo Jingshan's face almost froze. What did you do to her? It's nothing. It's just that before we took her away, we covered her mouth and nose with a drug in the toilet of the cabin, causing her to be unconscious until now. But she's awake now. She's opening her eyes. She's looking at me. Her eyes are filled with fear and confusion. Her expression is very surprised. She seems to be very afraid. The man on the other side of the phone said in a cold and gloomy voice, "Mr. Control, this woman is very important to you, isn't she?" The veins on Mo Jingshan's forehead bulged, and he suddenly looked back at the people behind him. Kay immediately asked someone to pick up the prepared computer and find the location of Jean Wan's cell phone signal with the help of the current call signal. However, after more than 10 seconds, the computer screen showed that he couldn't find her. Chapter 679. Alas, your woman is glaring at me. She seems to have heard what I'm talking to you about. She seems to understand her current situation. She is glaring at me. Interesting. Mr. Control, your woman seems to be brave. She has been awake for a minute, but she just looks at me coldly and doesn't make any noise or scream. Tut, I didn't expect her to be so calm. She is so beautiful. I wonder if she tastes good. If you dare to touch her, you'll have to pay with your life. Your brother Akib won't be the only one who will be killed. Mo Jingshan's expression remained calm, but his eyes grew colder. There's no need to waste words. Tell me your conditions. You should know the conditions. Give me the confidential channels I want to know and the contact information of the underground partners, including the other things I want to know. Why don't you give up the rights you and 11 Base have in the underground? What do you think? Shine Group is such a big company. Why should it have connections with the underground chaebol and the global arms dealers? All the channels of making money are in your hands. Since you don't intend to stain your hands with blood, just give them to me as soon as possible. Mo Jingshan didn't speak. Although he didn't find Jean Wan's location, Kay had quietly activated another searcher by his hand. At the same time, a faint red dot appeared in the signal detected by the instrument. Kay instantly captured the position of the red dot and turned to cooperate with the others to search for Jean Wan's location. Everything was a silent contest. Atuda knew that Mo Jingshan wouldn't agree easily. After all, this was related to the source of income of tens of thousands of people in the underground world, including the interests and life of Nan Hung, the other boss of 11 Base. If Mo Jingshan could give it to him so easily, so many things wouldn't have happened in Cambodia 3 years ago. And in this situation, if Mo Jingshan agreed too easily, there must be something fishy going on. Atuda didn't know whether Mo Jingshan would agree or not, so he said with a cold smile on the other side of the phone, "I can only keep your woman alive for 12 hours. If you can't give me what I want before noon tomorrow, I'll cut off one of your woman's hands and send it to you in a parcel with the flesh. I'm warning you one last time, don't touch her." Mo Jingshan said coldly, "Atuda, the fight between us has nothing to do with women. There's no need to involve women. You've exhausted all your means, but in the end, you only focus on women. Are you admitting that you're only good at kidnapping and threatening? What's the difference between this and your brother who died a long time ago? It's really a waste for your group of brothers to give you the title of God of Hell. In the end, you're just a trash who kidnaps women. To deal with you, Control, I can use normal means to deal with you. Since I can't do it openly, I'll do it in the dark. You've never had any weakness, but this woman is your biggest weakness. It's rare that you would answer my call in person. It seems that this woman is really special to you. I really want to know what it would feel like if I cut off her flesh piece by piece or press her under my body to taste her. TSK. TSK. It's exciting to think about it." Just as Mo Jingshan was about to crush the cell phone with a straight face, Atuda on the other end of the line suddenly gave a strange smile and looked at the figure who was curled up in a dark corner of the warehouse, warily looking at him. He slowly stood up, put the cell phone to his ear, and walked up to her step by step. She only remembered that when she boarded the plane and went to the bathroom to wash her hands. She suddenly found a short, thin, but very agile man hiding in the bathroom. She only remembered that the man suddenly closed the bathroom door and pressed her down. When she instinctively wanted to cry for help, he covered her mouth and nose with a wet thing. She struggled for a while and then passed out. She had been here ever since she woke up. First, she was at a loss. Then, she heard the voice of the man who really looked like a Keeb on the phone. She heard him sometimes speaking in Chinese and sometimes speaking in English. She roughly understood her current situation. She was kidnapped after getting on the plane. Akib's brother, the man named Atuda, used her to threaten Mo Jingshan. Seeing Atuda walking up to her step by step, the coldness and wariness in her eyes couldn't hide her nervousness. She curled up in the corner and looked around carefully, but it was dark around her. There was no light in the warehouse except for a strong flashlight on a metal shelf in front of her, which was shining on her. Mr. Control, your woman isn't as calm as she looks. She's actually scared. She's looking at me cautiously and warily, but at such a close distance, your woman is really beautiful. She's even more attractive than when I looked at her from a distance. Atuda's voice was filled with viciousness and threat as he walked towards her. Jean Wan leaned back against the corner, but Atuda suddenly stretched out a hand and grabbed her hair. Jean Wan almost cried out in pain, but when she remembered that he was talking to Mo Jingshan on the phone, she swallowed back her cry, clenched her teeth, and closed her eyes silently. Atuda didn't expect that the woman who had a gleam of fear in her eyes was so tough. He narrowed his eyes coldly, grabbed her hair harder, and warned, "Tell Control what I'm doing to you. Tell him that if he doesn't agree to my conditions, I'll make you wish you were dead." As he spoke, he placed the phone directly next to her ear and deliberately pressed it against her ear. Mo Jingshan heard the voice on the other side of the phone, only to find that it was very quiet on the other side except for the sound of rapid breathing. No one spoke. He frowned and asked tentatively, "Jean Wan?" Chapter 680. She went back to High City as he wished because she didn't want to be a burden to him, but she didn't expect that these people were lurking in the cabin. She couldn't let him be threatened by her. Otherwise, she didn't know what kind of danger he would face. 3 years ago, she had sneaked into the Cambodian bandits' lair and escaped alive. She had never been afraid of such a life-or-death situation. Now, she would rather die than let these people succeed. Jean Wan didn't speak or make any sound. She just kept her mouth shut and turned her head to avoid the cell phone that was pressed against her ear. Atuda's eyes turned cold. "You're really stubborn. What? Don't you want your husband to save you?" Jean Wan didn't answer but opened her eyes and looked expressionlessly at the man whose eyes were full of murderous intent. Her eyes were clearly saying to him, "Don't even think about it." "Jean Wan, say something." Mo Jingshan's voice rang in her ear. Mo Jingshan's voice rang in her ears. She fought back the torment in her heart and the fear in this environment. No matter what, she didn't want to be a burden to him. She just looked coldly at the man who almost tore her scalp off at this moment. Her face grew paler and paler because of the pain, but she still gritted her teeth and didn't make a sound. Atuda suddenly let go of her hair and slapped her hard in the face. The slap was so loud that Mo Jingshan on the other side of the phone looked stern and cold. "Jean Wan." Jean Wan was knocked to the side with such force that she hit the wall next to her. Her face was burning with pain, and her head hit the wall hard. She only let out a low hiss from the pain, but it was just a small gasp and she didn't make any more sound. "Originally, I wanted to play with you, but your grandfather hates stubborn women like you who don't know how to cooperate." Atuda stepped forward, grabbed her hair again, and dragged her more than 2 meters away. When Jean Wan swallowed her scream in pain, he threw her hard to the ground. "Don't you want to talk? I have many ways to let him see how miserable you are now. Do you want him to see how you are ravaged and beaten by me in the cell phone video?" Atuda said as he gave Jean Wan, who was almost paralyzed on the ground, a hard kick on her stomach. Jean Wan fell to the ground in pain, curled up instinctively, and covered her stomach with her hands. She bit her lips so hard that they bled, but she still refused to make a sound. Although Mo Jingshan couldn't hear Jean Wan's voice on the other side of the phone, Atuda's voice was too loud. Mo Jingshin looked coldly at the searching device on the other computer next to him, clenched his cell phone, and clenched his fingers so hard that his slender knuckles turned white. You still won't talk? Atuda looked at the woman who had fallen to the ground, dragged her up again, slapped her hard on her swollen face, and kicked her to the ground. Jinwan was kicked back and hit hard against a corner of the metal frame. She didn't know how sharp the edge of the metal frame was, but she knew something had pierced her shoulder. She trembled in pain and her back was stained with blood. Ah, you're bleeding. Atuda snorted and looked at the woman lying on the ground with her eyes closed. There were tears on her face, blood on the corner of her mouth, and blood on her shoulder. Her face was as pale as a corpse, but she still wouldn't make a sound. He narrowed his eyes coldly and suddenly gave a look to his two subordinates who were walking in from outside the door. The two men nodded, turned to find 2 basins of water with ice and poured it on Jinwan. Jinwan slowly opened her eyes, but there was still darkness in front of her and pain all over her body. At this moment, she was in so much pain that she didn't even have the strength to cry out. Seeing that she had woken up, Atuda walked up to her step by step and slowly squatted beside her. He looked down at her as if looking at an ant that would be trampled to death by him at any time. If you don't speak, my brothers will let you know what it means to live a life worse than death. I wonder how the women Mo Jingshin has slept with taste. Their skin is so white and tender, but it's so red and swollen after a few hits. With that, Atuda touched her face twice. Jinwan suddenly turned her face away and tried to avoid his hand. At this time, Atuda handed her the cell phone and winked at her, asking her to speak. As a vigilant man as Mr. Control, if he couldn't hear this woman's voice, he wouldn't act rashly even if he believed this woman was his wife. He had to make this woman speak. He had to make sure that she was his woman. He had to make Mr. Control, who had always been calm, panic. Otherwise, their plan would only be stalled, and it would be no good for them to stay in Los Angeles. Unlike Cambodia, it was too dangerous to act here. Jinwan took a look at the cell phone he handed over. She still didn't speak, but her eyes seemed to be hesitating. She slowly raised her sore and stiff hand and was about to take the cell phone. Atuda stared at her coldly. He didn't give her the cell phone but still kept the gesture of handing it to her. Just as Jinwan raised her hand and touched the phone, she suddenly swatted her hand away from his hand with great force. The moment the phone fell to the ground, the screen instantly shattered, but the phone didn't hang up as she wished. Atuda suddenly cursed and kicked Jinwan hard again. Jinwan didn't know what to do next. This time, Jinwan couldn't help groaning. Although her voice was low, the cell phone fell beside her, and the sound came into Mo Jingshin's ears through the loudspeaker. Mo Jingshin's eyes were bloodshot. The cell phone had been put on speaker mode, and everyone behind him could hear it. Mr. Mo. Feeling nervous and angry, Kay looked at the signal on the computer screen and suddenly spoke in a low voice. Mo Jingshin turned his eyes to the direction of the signal, hung up the phone, picked up the electronic car key, and walked out. Chapter 681. Atuda picked up the phone only to find it had been hung up. He didn't know whether it was Mo Jingshin who hung up or the phone was broken. He looked back and gave his 2 men an impatient look. The 2 men rushed up to lift Jinwan from the ground and carried her to the only metal shelf in the dark warehouse. As soon as she was placed on it, the cold touch of the metal frame caused Jinwan to shiver all over. Lying on the higher ground, she saw through the strong light of the flashlight that there was a table by the side with several items placed on it. It was a needle filled with some unknown medicine, a knife and a gun. It was a tall black medicine bottle, and a rope. There were several other things that she couldn't even imagine under normal circumstances. Was this the place where the top 10 tortures were performed? Or what? Jinwan looked stiffly at those things. When Atuda came over and saw the fear in her eyes, he said coldly, "After noon tomorrow, if Mo Jingshin is 5 minutes late, I'll let you taste one of these wonderful things." With that, Atuda picked up the needle and played with it wantonly in his hand. "Do you know what this is?" Jinwan stared at the needle in his hand. When she saw the few drops of liquid squeezed out of the needle, she felt a chill run down her spine. She slowly curled up on the cold metal frame, fearing that he would inject the contents of the needle into her body. Atuda slowly reached out to her with the needle in his hand and put the sharp tip of the needle close to her arm. Seeing the deep panic in her eyes, he sneered. This syringe contains one of the most difficult drugs to quit in the world in the past 20 years. Many people have lost their families because of it, and many people have committed suicide because they couldn't quit. Hearing this, Jinwan widened her eyes in disbelief. Atuda glanced at her coldly. As the price for angering me, guess how I should punish you now? Jinwan took 2 deep breaths and tried desperately to pull her hand out of his hand. But Atuda sneered at her struggle, continued to hold her wrist and was about to insert the needle into her skin. No, no. Jinwan struggled hard. You'd better behave yourself. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that I won't take your life right now. *TCH. Atuda held her down and pierced the needle into her arm. Jinwan gave a low cry of pain. Before Atuda could push the needle into her body, there was a strange beeping alarm outside the warehouse. Atuda was shocked and turned to look at his 2 men in the warehouse. What's going on? How could they find the signal so quickly? How could they blow up our signal shielding device? Even the latest jamming device from the UK can't stop those tech dogs in 11 base. The 2 men panicked when they heard the warning beep. They turned to look at Atuda, who was furious. Brother, since the signal location has been found, I'm afraid they'll be here soon. Shine Group is one of the giants in the global technology field, and there are many capable people in 11 base who study military technology. Their teleportation speed is beyond imagination. What should we do? Do up with us? Or do we hold this woman in our hands as a threat? Atuda suddenly pulled out the needle and looked coldly at Jinwan, who was still wet because she was not injected with the needle, and said fiercely, "Take her away!" With that, Atuda quickly turned and walked out. Jinwan didn't understand what had happened. She only knew that the thing in the needle hadn't been injected into her body. What did he mean by blowing up the signal device? This was something she had never experienced before. At this moment, the 2 men came forward and directly lifted her up, carrying her on their backs and walking out. Where are you taking me? Jinwan hung weakly on their shoulders, her body aching all over. Her voice was very soft, and all she could see was blood. She felt she had fallen into hell and didn't know when it would end. But the only thing in her mind was, she couldn't let Mo Jingshan show up, she couldn't let him come. She couldn't let him be threatened because of her. She couldn't let him take the risk. For a long time, Jinwan couldn't understand why Mo Jingshan forced her to leave in order to change the course of her life. She couldn't understand why he had to hurt her and force her to leave. She couldn't understand how he could bear all the pain alone as if he didn't feel anything. What she hated most was that he didn't consider her feelings. But now in such an environment, Jinwan suddenly realized. It turned out that a person's greatest love was to bear all the pain that the other party couldn't bear. He would rather bear everything alone than let the other party suffer with him. At this moment, she finally understood Mo Jingshan's forbearance. He just wanted her to live. Because of love, he had to bear the burden for her. Because of love, he had to let her leave and live a good life and grow up well. Because of love, he had to help her deal with all the things she couldn't do without her knowing. In order to let her live freely, he endured in a place she didn't know without saying a word. He didn't even see her or call her, just like she was now. She would rather he didn't know anything. She would rather he didn't hear her voice. She would rather he didn't take the risk because of her. At least he had to live a good life. Don't be threatened. Jinwan didn't know why these 3 people were panicking, but after she was carried out, her head was suddenly covered with a layer of black cloth. A car seemed to be driving up, and the 2 people carrying her opened the door and threw her in. Jinwan fell in the car and didn't have the strength to sit up. Her body was screaming in pain. The wound on the back of her shoulder seemed to have stopped bleeding, but her head was in a mess and her ears were ringing because of the previous impact. She could only feel that those people were anxiously driving away, but she couldn't understand what they were saying, because now they were speaking to each other in the Khmer language of Cambodia, instead of the awkward Chinese or English that she could understand. Chapter 682. We can't throw her down. We have to take her with us. Control has always been unpredictable. This time, we finally have a weakness in our hands. If this woman wasn't our biggest bargaining chip, I wouldn't have tried so hard to kidnap her. If she isn't in our hands, how can I get what I want from him? Atuda sat in the passenger seat and looked cold. As he spoke, Atuda looked back at Jinwan, who couldn't sit up because of the pain all over her body. She lay on the back seat, struggling to breathe. She struggled to get up but couldn't, and even twitched because of the pain from being stabbed in the back by the metal frame. He sneered and looked at the evening sky outside. Let's leave first. Control will find a way to find us if he can't find us. We must transfer this woman to a place where he can't find her for the time being before he and the people of 11 Base carry out a full-scale interception. Jinwan slowly turned her eyes to Atuda in the passenger seat. Although she didn't understand what they were talking about, she could guess that they wanted to take her to a place where Mo Jingshin couldn't find her. She put her hands weakly under the leather seat and slowly clenched her fists. The car had been speeding for a long time, and the sky had gradually darkened. Suddenly, the surroundings lit up with a blinding light from the headlights. The light was so bright that it affected the driver's vision, making it impossible for the driver to continue driving forward. "Brother, we're surrounded." Atuda raised his hand to shield his eyes, and then looked out of the window at the black SUVs that were quickly encircling them. Then he looked coldly at Jinwan, who was still lying motionless on the back seat. No wonder she's Control's woman. She was just taken away a few hours ago. It's not the 24 hours I promised, but he came so soon. Atuda's eyes were very fierce. Your life is in our hands. Since he wants to surround us, let his woman die first. At the same time, Atuda suddenly ordered, use the rear of the car to collide with them. Even if the woman in the back is killed by the impact, use her life to open a bloody path to escape. He said this in Chinese. Jinwan heard it clearly. She slowly raised her eyes and looked at the crazy man who was almost perverted. In an instant, the surrounding cars had approached, and the man in the driver's seat suddenly hit the headlights of the black SUVs with the rear of the car. In an instant, the car was hit by all kinds of violent bumps and bumps. Jinwan was thrown off the back seat because of the sudden violent collision. She fell under the seat, only to feel that the collision behind her was getting faster and faster, and the force was getting stronger and stronger. Obviously, the car was going to be destroyed. Because of the impact, her whole body was stuck to the car door. She wanted to raise her hand to stabilize her body, but she couldn't grab anything. She suddenly fell from one side of the car door to the other. Her head hit the inner lock of the door. The metal handle of the door was very hard, and the pain made her dizzy. It seemed that a string in her mind was about to snap. However, before she could sit still, the car collided violently again. Jinwan couldn't control her body. The people sitting in the front looked at the cars outside cautiously and fiercely. They looked around at the impenetrable encirclement and couldn't believe that they had been blocked by Mo Jingshin's men so quickly. Outside the car, the leading black off-road vehicle galloped over in the encirclement. Kay looked at the car in front, which had been seriously deformed due to the violent collision, and immediately turned to look at Mo Jingshin, who was sitting in the driver's seat with a solemn look. "Mr. Mo, they deliberately hit us with the rear part of the car. Will they?" Mo Jingshin didn't speak but just looked in that direction. Calmly, he suddenly sped up the car and rushed in that direction when Kay didn't expect it at all. "Brother." In the car in front, the two subordinates could no longer control the direction of the car. Just as they were about to escape toward the highway ahead, the black off-road vehicle suddenly rushed over at a speed of more than 220 kilometers per hour and sped past them. At the same time, the car quickly turned around and decisively stopped in the middle of the road to block their path. The car suddenly screeched to a halt. Jinwan's entire body was in so much pain that she almost lost consciousness. She didn't know where her body was stuck in the back of the car, but she couldn't move. Waves of dizziness surged in her head, and she felt worse than carsick. Atuda looked at the car ahead in the silent night until the door of the car opened and Mo Jingshin in black appeared in their sight. At the same time, Kay got out of the car on the other side and walked up behind Mo Jingshin. Kay and the people who got out of the cars behind took out their guns at the same time and fired several shots at Atuda's car, which couldn't move because of the deformation. The car shook, fell down, and all the tires were burst. Jin-Wan couldn't see the man walking towards them step by step in the dark, but she instinctively felt that the two men in the car seemed to be in a panic. Atuda suddenly reached behind, pulled Jin-Wan out of the corner under the seat, and dragged her to the front of the car. When Jin-Wan was unable to struggle and pressed her head against the front window, he pointed a gun at her forehead. The car was surrounded by headlights from all directions, but Jin-Wan's pale face was almost pressed against the front window. The lights and moonlight reflected in the car made her look frighteningly pale. Her whole body was numb from the pain. She closed her eyes and did not look out, afraid that Mo Jingshin would see the fear in her eyes. She closed her eyes and suddenly smiled. "Stinking bitch, why are you smiling?" Atuda only knew that Jin-Wan was very important to Mo Jingshin, but he forgot that she was the most important person to him, so he wouldn't allow her to be in danger for too long. Let alone 24 hours, he wouldn't even allow her to be in danger for 2 hours. How could he come here so quickly? Atuda angrily grabbed Jin-Wan's clothes on her shoulder and slowly pulled the trigger at her gun. Even if he had to confront Mo Jingshin, as long as he had her as his bargaining chip, he didn't believe Mo Jingshin would dare to kill him. Chapter 683. Atuda flew into a rage and was about to shoot, when Jin-Wan suddenly grabbed his wrist and bit hard at him with all her strength. Ah! Atuda was in so much pain that he couldn't control the direction of the gun, but the sound of a shot rang in the car and the bullet hit the bulletproof glass window. The muffled sound of the gunshot in the car was particularly clear. Mo Jingshin, who had approached, suddenly looked at the dark window of the car with a cold look in his eyes. Jin-Wan also looked up at the murderous look in Atuda's eyes. Mo Jingshin was outside the car. Since he had come here, and Kay and the others had come to save her, she couldn't sit still and wait for death. Atuda suddenly threw Jin-Wan away and aimed the gun at her head again. Jin-Wan stared into his eyes and slowly raised her hand. Her blood-stained hand looked cold in the dark car. Noticing her movement, Atuda pulled the trigger again. Jin-Wan suddenly raised her hand and grabbed his hand holding the gun, staring at him coldly. When he was about to shoot her, she suddenly said in Khmer language, "Don't worry, I'll shoot you. Don't worry, I won't kill you. You're not going to kill me. I'll kill you." Atuda froze and the murderous look in his eyes intensified. He narrowed his eyes and focused all his attention on her. 3 years ago, when Jin-Wan was by the Cambodian old lady's side, she accidentally overheard her saying this. She had learned this phrase from her. Now it came in handy. Just when Atuda's attention was attracted by Jin-Wan's words, the car suddenly collided violently. Atuda, who had been sitting steadily, suddenly leaned back. The gun missed Jin-Wan's head and Jin-Wan raised her hand to grab the gun. Atuda raised the gun with one hand, grabbed her hair with the other, cursed her hard, and slammed her head against the car door. Jin-Wan's forehead was cut and she was in a trance. Outside the car, Mo Jingshin found the best opportunity to escape. The car behind rushed forward at the same time. At the moment when the car was about to run away, the people in the car saw 2 figures nimbly jump onto the car. Kay followed Mo Jingshin closely and suddenly pulled the door open. Jin-Wan, who was forced to lean against the car door, almost exposed her upper body because of the force of the door opening. The moment he saw Jin-Wan covered in blood, Mo Jingshin paused and saw that Jin-Wan was about to fall from the speeding car. 3 years ago, the scene of her falling from the car on the Los Angeles freeway and losing her unborn child appeared in his mind. Mo Jingshin furrowed his brows, reached out his arm, and leaped down. The meaning of the Khmer phrase Jin-Wan had just uttered was, "Those who threaten the weak are the truly weak." Atuda was used to being in the limelight and would never admit defeat. He was irritated by her taunt, so he lost his mind and focused all his attention on Jin-Wan, because he didn't expect she could speak their language. This was what the old Cambodian woman said when she rescued her, protected her in front of a keeb, took her back to the tent, and bandaged her wounds. Jean Wan understood what the old Cambodian woman meant. The old Cambodian woman didn't like them bullying a weak woman, but she didn't dare to say it to her face, so she whispered it to her in the tent. Jean Wan learned this sentence at that time. Later, when she was in London, she accidentally saw a dictionary of this country in the library. She casually flipped through it, compared the meaning of that sentence, and finally understood the meaning of this sentence she learned. But now, because he was distracted, Atuda suddenly looked up at Mo Jingshin and Kay, who had rushed to the roof of the car, and angrily asked his two men in the car to speed up and throw them off. Jean Wan almost fell from the open car door. She looked up at Mo Jingshin, who had reached out to her, and the tears that she had been holding back fell from the corner of her eyes. She opened her mouth, but because the car was too fast and the wind was too loud, she couldn't hear what she was saying, but Mo Jingshin had already seen her lips move. "You, be careful." Mo Jingshin frowned, and Kay stretched out an arm behind him to help him bend down to save Jean Wan, shouting, "Mr. Mo, there's a turn ahead, and it's easy to be thrown off. We must go down immediately. Don't go down, otherwise the car will exceed the speed limit. We can't keep our balance." With that, Kay took Mo Jingshin's arm with one hand and clung to the edge of the driver's window with the other, trying to harass the driver inside to slow down the car. "Don't slow down. Rush over," Atuda said as he raised his gun and aimed at Mo Jingshin, who had leaned out of the open car door. Mo Jingshin's eyes were fixed on Jean Wan's tearful eyes. An unimaginably deep pain and heartache attacked all his senses. Jean Wan's eyes were almost saying goodbye to him. She didn't expect to be rescued alive, nor did she want him to pay any price for saving her. Her eyes were full of calmness. Her calmness caused countless waves to surge in his heart. He suddenly grabbed her ice-cold hand and pulled her out of the car with all his might. This difficult move put Mo Jingshin in the most dangerous position. Seeing that Atuda was about to shoot, Kay hurriedly got down to the driver's seat when Mo Jingshin yanked Jean Wan out of the car and quickly aimed the gun at the driver's forehead. The car suddenly began to shake unsteadily because of the loss of control of the steering wheel and couldn't move forward steadily. Atuda's hand was swayed. Before he could open the bulletproof car window to shoot Mo Jingshin had rolled to the ground with Jean Wan. Jean Wan was already so numb that she could not feel any pain. However, her entire body was held in Mo Jingshin's arms. The shock from the landing caused her heart to tremble, but the first to land was Mo Jingshin's body. He used his body to protect her, and because of the inertia from falling from the car, he held her tightly and rolled several times on the road. When they finally stopped, Mo Jingshin put one hand on her side and got up as if a lost treasure had finally come back to him. He put his hand behind her head and hugged her tightly. Chapter 684. The car in the distance had begun to change lanes, and Kay was still confronting those people in the car. When the other SUVs saw that Mo Jingshin had taken Jean Wan away from the car safely, they were ready to attack the car at any time. Leaning against Mo Jingshin's arms, Jean Wan slowly opened her eyes but didn't have the strength to move. Felt really safe to rest her head on his chest. She had thought she would die, but now she was rescued safe and sound. Making sure she was out of danger, she closed her eyes and let out a long breath. Mo Jingshin looked down at the wounds on her head and all over her body, the red and swollen marks on her face caused by Atuda, and then the blood on her back and the blood on the corner of her mouth. Her hair was disheveled and she was almost unrecognizable. Mo Jingshin stroked her face. He couldn't imagine what she had experienced in just a few hours. The great fear and pain in the past few hours almost made her lose consciousness. She just stared at him with her eyes wide open, staring at this man who had rescued her from the abyss at a moment of life and death. She finally believed what kind of skills and courage this man, who was sometimes cold and sometimes gentle, had. Just like the Mo Jingshin she met in Cambodia 3 years ago, his judgment 11 base behind him, and his men and brothers who were as skilled as Kay. When he put on a suit, he was the eye-catching CEO, but when he took off his suit, he was a cold and decisive man. This was the Mo Jingshin she was familiar with and the man she loved. He was willing to endure everything for her, and so was she. Jean Wan understood his love at the moment of life and death, But at this moment, in the vast world, she just stared at him blankly and felt dizzy. She was motionless and couldn't even say a complete sentence. Jin Wan speak. Mo Jingshan had guessed that she would be hurt by Atuda, but he didn't expect she would be hurt to this extent. He had found her as fast as he could, but Atuda was a lunatic with no humanity at all. Seeing the blood on the corner of her mouth and on her head, Mo Jingshan suppressed his surging killing intent. Seeing that she didn't speak, he suddenly picked her up by the waist. Mo Jingshan. Jin Wan slowly opened her mouth when she was about to be picked up by him, but her voice was as soft as a mosquito's. Mo Jingshan paused and looked down at her, thinking that he had hurt her. A car will come soon and take you to the hospital. Tell me where it hurts. He kept his voice very low as if he was afraid to scare her who was so fragile and injured, or more likely to scare himself who was hiding in his heart and was about to go crazy. Even in Cambodia, Jin Wan hadn't been hurt like this. At that time, she was kicked by Dolly, burned on her hands, and a gun was pointed at her head. He hated her so much that he wanted to kill Dolly at the last moment. Right now, Mo Jingshan was relying on his rationality to keep calm, but Jin Wan gently shook her head in his arms, buried her face in his shirt, and breathed in the smell of his arms. It was clean, refreshing, cold, and had the unique warmth of him. I'm sorry that you were threatened by them and put you in danger. I wasn't careful enough. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come to Los Angeles. Mo Jingshan's calm black eyes were suddenly filled with heartache. It has nothing to do with you. If they didn't find you by my side, they would have made trouble for others. My parents are still in Los Angeles. Even if you stay in High City, they can't turn their target to you, but they will use other means. To people like them, anything related to me is just a means for them to defeat me. Seeing the apology in Jin Wan's eyes, Mo Jingshan held her head in his hands, bent down to kiss her hair, and said in a low voice, "You came to Los Angeles to talk about business. You are the head of MN Group, and it's not realistic to keep you in High City. You didn't implicate me. It's my fault for putting you in danger, not yours. Wan, tell me where it hurts. Don't hold it in and don't blame yourself, do you hear me?" Jin Wan smiled weakly. Back then, I should have learned how to shoot properly from Feng Ling. In the end, I didn't even take self-defense seriously. If I was more skilled, I could at least help you and not drag you down. Mo Jingshan furrowed his brows and held her tightly in his arms. He kissed her hair, the blood on her forehead, and finally her ears. He gently said, "I don't need it. You just need to be yourself. I love you for who you are right now. You don't need to change. You don't need to learn anything. You don't need to change. You don't need to touch these things. A peaceful life is the most precious. I'd rather you live in peace forever than touch anything related to guns and kidnappings. Good girl. Don't let your imagination run wild." Jin Wan's face hurt, perhaps because the wind on the road was too cold and piercing. She couldn't see how frighteningly pale her blood-covered face was. She just pressed her head against his chest and said hoarsely, "Say, if I die in their hands today, will I still return to the place where we met? Or will I only have this one chance to return to your side? Will I never be able to find you again?" "What nonsense are you talking about?" Mo Jingshan's heart missed a beat. Seeing Jin Wan trembling in pain and cold in his arms, he took off his coat and put it over her. At this moment, several cars came from behind, which seemed to be the same model as the cars driven by the people of 11 Base. Mo Jingshan was about to carry Jin Wan to get up, when suddenly he paused, looked at the two black off-road vehicles that suddenly stopped a few meters away, and glanced at the license plates of those cars. They were indeed 11 Base's cars, and the license plates belonged to the group of off-road vehicles that 11 Base remembered. But there were almost invisible bloodstains on the black wheels. Just as Mo Jingshan was about to carry Jin Wan up, the driver's door of the two cars was suddenly opened, and two of Atuda's men jumped out and pointed their guns at Mo Jingshan. Kay and the other cars were surrounding Atuda's car in the distance, but they didn't expect that the people who came to support them had been intercepted by Atuda's men, and they drove 11 Base's cars to confuse them. Chapter 685. She was not so afraid when she was alone in Atuta's hands. But now Imo Jingshin didn't have a gun in his hand, and Kay and the others couldn't come back in a short time. Imo Jingshin was afraid that she would be hurt, so he kept holding her like this. If the two men shot at him, he wouldn't be able to dodge. Jinwan grasped the cuff of his shirt tightly and whispered, "Let's go. Don't worry about me." Imo Jingshin, however, picked Jinwan up expressionlessly, as if he didn't see the two men who were pointing their guns at them. He just glanced at the blood on the tires of the two SUVs and his eyes darkened. He was the one who was pointed at by the black muzzles, but because he was so calm, the two men with guns looked at him cautiously and kept their hands on the trigger with vigilance. Imo Jingshin held Jinwan firmly as if he hadn't heard what she had just said. Jinwan whispered again in his arms, "Imo Jingshin, don't speak." Imo Jingshin said to Jinwan gently as he coldly glanced at the two Cambodian men who were holding guns. Jinwan closed her mouth but looked at the two men from time to time. Seeing the guns in their hands, she was not worried about Imo Jingshin's kung fu. But now he was holding her in his arms and couldn't grab the guns or protect himself. "Mr. Control, tell your men to let go of our brother right now." One of them spat out a string of English. "Atuta has hundreds of brothers behind him. Even if he is taken away by you today, you will still die in our hands, even if it's a life for a life." With that, the man said coldly, "Our brother just wants what he wants from you, not your life. Don't force us to shoot you." Imo Jingshin seemed not to hear him and turned to walk away with Jinwan in his arms. The two men froze, looked at each other, and suddenly rushed up and put their guns against his back. "Stop!" Imo Jingshin paused, but he did not let go of Jinwan. Jinwan gripped his sleeves tightly and looked up at him worriedly. However, she could only see the man's cold jaw and calm expression. The two Cambodians cautiously put their guns against his back and said with a cold face, "Mr. Control, although our brother doesn't intend to kill you before he gets what he wants, if our brother dies in your hands today, you'll have to pay for it. Don't think we won't shoot." At this moment, Imo Jingshin turned his head and looked at the two fierce-looking men behind him out of the corner of his eye, asking coldly, "Did you get your guns from the members of 11 Base?" The two men paused and glanced at the guns in their hands hesitantly. These guns were indeed taken from the members of 11 Base in the two cars when they were killed because their own guns were out of bullets. "Do you think I don't know if there are bullets in this gun? You can try to shoot and see if I'll die." Imo Jingshin smiled coldly. His voice was calm, but it caused the two of them to be greatly shocked. How could there be no bullets? It was said that the people of 11 Base would use up their bullets even when they were on the verge of death and would never leave one more bullet for the enemy. Was it true? Did they only have a limited number of bullets in their guns and had used them up before they were killed? But they were killed in one shot and had no time to use up bullets. Although the two men were sure that there should be bullets in their guns, they still hesitated because of Imo Jingshin's words. When the two men hesitantly looked at the guns in their hands, at the critical moment, he suddenly turned around with Jinwan in his arms and kicked hard at the hands of the two men who were almost touching each other. At the same time, Kay, who had noticed the situation 100 meters away, rushed over. When the two men's guns were kicked away and they staggered back a few steps, Kay drove over and hit them hard into the air. There was a violent crash. Imo Jingshin's face was expressionless, but he immediately covered Jinwan's eyes with his hand so that she wouldn't see the two men being hit by the car and then falling heavily to the ground. But just by hearing the sound, Jinwan knew how fast Kay's car was coming. The two men were knocked to the ground. Even if they didn't die, they would be half dead. Jinwan leaned against his arms and didn't struggle or pull his hand down to see this scene. When everything was quiet, the two men who were knocked to the ground and couldn't even make a sound twitched on the ground when Kay shot them twice. The next second, they opened their eyes wide and died unwillingly. Imo Jingshin put down his hand that covered Jinwan's eyes and gently put her down. When Jinwan's feet touched the ground, he turned back and called Kay over. "Help her into the car." Kay nodded and quickly came over to support Jinwan, who could barely stand. At the same time, he saw Imo Jingshin walk coldly to the two Cambodian men who had just been killed, step on the blood on the ground, slowly bend down, and pick up the two guns that had just fallen from their hands. Kay knew that Mr. Mo was looking at the numbers on the two guns to determine which two men in the base were killed by them. Just when Kay turned around and was about to help Jean Wan into the car, suddenly, a black gun quietly stuck out of the rear window of the two cars that had been driven by the Cambodian men. Kay had turned around and was supporting Jean Wan, and Mo Jingshan had also looked at the numbers on the guns. Only Jean Wan, who was about to be helped into the car, kept turning her head to look at Mo Jingshan and immediately saw the gun sticking out of the car. Bang! Watch out! At the moment the gunshot rang out, Jean Wan used all her strength to push Kay away and staggered toward Mo Jingshan, who was not far away from her. Mo Jingshan also turned his eyes the second before the gunshot rang out, but it was too late. Jean Wan suddenly rushed over, pushed him away, and quickly stood in front of him. Mo Jingshan's expression changed from astonishment to shock, and then the woman in his arms trembled and fell limp in his arms because she was shot in the back. His internal organs and the blue veins on his forehead bulged, and everything seemed to explode in an instant. Jean Wan! Mrs. Mo. The shot hit the back of Jean Wan's neck 2 or 3 inches below, which was almost the same as the wound she had suffered on the metal shelf in the dark warehouse. In an instant, more blood gushed out of her back, soaking her clothes that had already been dyed red. Chapter 686. Mo Jingshan almost had to hold her back hard to keep her from falling, but she fell hard into his arms because of the force of the bullet. Then Jean Wan almost spurted out a mouthful of blood. She was still conscious and didn't want him to be too sad or worried, so she tried hard to swallow the blood, but there was still a steady stream of blood flowing out of her mouth. Kay had rushed forward and caught the man who had been hiding in the car for a long time. He dragged him out of the car and threw him hard to the ground. He grabbed the gun and stepped on his back, almost breaking the man's spine. The man was still shouting in Cambodian. Kay looked up and saw the back of Jean Wan's body covered with blood. He was so angry that his eyes were bloodshot. He kicked him hard in the back, picked up the gun on the ground, and shot him several times in the back of the head. When the disgusting brain of the trash on the ground almost burst out, he threw the gun hard on the ground and turned to walk back quickly. Mo Jingshan held Jean Wan, who could barely stand, in his arms. He covered the place on her back where the bullet had just hit her and couldn't wipe the blood that kept gushing out of her mouth with the other hand. He hugged her tightly with bloodshot eyes. "Don't be afraid. It's all right. Let's go to the doctor right away and take out the bullet. Don't be afraid, be good. Nwan. It's all right, it's all right." Although he said so, neither Kay nor Jean Wan had seen Mo Jingshan so panicked for the first time. When Jean Wan's body suddenly fell down weakly, Mo Jingshan also knelt on the ground and still held her tightly in his arms. "You lunatic! Who asked you to take the bullet for me? Who told you I wouldn't avoid it? Who asked you to rush over so stupidly? Huh?" Jean Wan seemed to see Mo Jingshan's reddened eyes in the pain and grogginess. She opened her mouth to smile, but more blood gushed out of her mouth. Mo Jingshan rushed to wipe it for her, but even though his sleeves and hands were stained red, the blood in her mouth was still the same as the blood in the wound on her back, gurgling as if it would not stop. "Mrs. Mo." Seeing Mo Jingshan's hand on Jean Wan's back, Kay's heart sank. This gunshot wound was at the lower part of the neck. How could Mr. Mo not see the position of the gunshot wound? Any deviation of a few millimeters would have instantly killed him. It was a nearly fatal shot. Jean Wan fell into Mo Jingshan's arms and wanted to laugh, but she knew that if she laughed, there would only be more blood and Mo Jingshan would only be sadder, so she stopped laughing. She closed her mouth and twitched the corner of her mouth, but in a moment, she couldn't hold back the blood in her mouth and it flowed out along the corner of her mouth bit by bit, and then more and more blood came out. This feeling was very familiar. It was like when she was dying in prison in her previous life. The blood in her mouth seemed to flow endlessly. It was so painful. But she had never seen Mo Jingshan's expression as though the sky had collapsed. She had never seen such a look in his eyes that made her heart ache. She had thought that even if the sky collapsed, he wouldn't blink, but it turned out that he would also have such a broken expression. Jean Wan's eyes were filled with tears. She didn't want to cry, but the tears mixed with the blood on her chin. It was sticky and fishy, and there was a disgusting taste of blood and rust in her mouth. Mo Jingshan. Jean Wan slowly raised her hand and tried to touch his hand that was also dyed red with her blood. As soon as her hand touched him, he held it hard. Do you think that you're the only one who's willing to endure everything for me? Do you think only you know how to love? Jean Wan's vision darkened and she could barely see clearly. She stared at the man's face with her empty eyes that were about to lose focus. She seemed to see his tears. Mo Jingshan's tears. When this man rushed to England for her, he was willing to do anything. He could cut her heart piece by piece without any expression on his face. It turned out that he could also cry, "Don't speak, don't speak." Mo Jingshan looked at the blood in her mouth, let go of her hand, and put his hand on her mouth. "Don't speak, Wan. If you have anything to say, wait until the bullet is taken out. Wait until you are well." Jean Wan closed her eyes. "I'm afraid if I don't say it now, I won't have a chance to say it again." "No." Mo Jingshan covered the wound on her back with his hand. "Be good, Wan, be good. Don't speak. Let's go to the hospital now. Los Angeles has the best doctors in the world. You will be safe and sound. Good girl. I'm here for you." She felt that her eyes were almost closed, but she still tried to open them, but she could barely see his face in the blur. Inform the Los Angeles Traffic Bureau to clear all the roads leading to the hospital. Take her to the hospital immediately. Don't let there be any obstacles. Don't waste a second." When Kay hurriedly drove the car to the side, Mo Jingshan didn't wait for Jean Wan to speak and directly carried her into the car. Kay nodded, put on the headphones, and sped up the car crazily. The car was instantly infected by the smell of blood on Jean Wan. Jean Wan felt sharp pain all over her body, and the only thing that made her feel safe and warm was Mo Jingshan's arms. She couldn't hold it anymore and closed her eyes again. At this time, Mo Jingshan pinched her chin hard as if deliberately making her stay awake in pain, and said in a low, commanding tone, "Open your eyes. Don't sleep." Jean Wan's eyelashes moved and she opened her eyes a little. Mo Jingshan held her tightly, and his hands were covered with sticky blood. Jean Wan was like a person who had been fished out of the blood, and there was not a clean place on her chest or back. She just looked at him, at his chin that was stained with her blood, but no matter what, this man was still very good-looking. Mo Jingshan, don't you think? Life is full of unknowns. Jean Wan swallowed hard the blood in her mouth, looked at him with a smile, and said with some difficulty, "Life is only a few decades. We don't know what we will encounter. I would rather, in the first 3 years, be with you, than let you endure so much alone for me." She slowly raised her hand and stroked his almost twisted eyebrows. "But, thank you for loving me, both in this life. Thank you for not really giving up on me. Thank you for still wanting me. Mo Jingshan, I said I didn't love you, but it's not true. I love you very, very much, and never stopped. Chapter 687. Kay kept driving forward almost at a racing speed, and the wheels screeched from time to time when they got off the highway. Jean Wan didn't want to see him like this. She swallowed blood and raised her hand to touch his face, trying to turn him back into the man who could plan and control everything. She wanted him to be fine, but she only raised her hand halfway and almost fell down again. Mo Jingshan grasped her hand in time and pressed her bloody hand against his face. Jean Wan had never seen him so disheveled. His face was covered with blood because of her, but he still looked so beautiful. Jean Wan leaned in his arms and smiled again. Feeling Mo Jingshan's hand on her back, she felt that she was surrounded by the world's sense of security. At least in this life she would not die alone. At least she was in his arms. But she was so sad that Mo Jingshan would probably be left alone in the future. It was very quiet in the car. Kay didn't say a word. He was focused on driving, even driving crazily. It was so quiet in the car that only Mo Jingshan and Jean Wan seemed to be there. But Mo Jingshan didn't say a word but kept wiping the blood from Jean Wan's mouth. because of what Jean Wan said just now. He held her tightly in his arms, and his calm eyes were now dark red. Jean Wan leaned in his arms and didn't move or speak. She was really in pain and tired and had no strength at all. She even gradually felt a little numb, as if she couldn't feel any pain. Took Mo Jingshan less than 3 hours to bring her back to him. Even though she was covered with wounds and might die in his arms bit by bit, at least the fear and torture were finally over. Now she could only feel grateful. She didn't know what to do with Mo Jingshan. Instead, Mo Jingshan took Mo Jingshan a few hours to bring her back to him. Although she was covered with wounds and might die in his arms bit by bit, at least the fear and torture were finally over. She was grateful that he did everything he could for her. She was so grateful. Jean Wan had been swallowing blood, but now she couldn't even move. Mo Jingshan pinched her hand on his face and said hoarsely, "Be obedient. Don't sleep." She could only vaguely feel Mo Jingshan kissing her eyes, pinching her chin, and even pressing her philtrum to force her to open her eyes. She tried hard for a long time but only furrowed her brows slightly. She said hoarsely in a voice that could only be heard when he lowered his head to approach, "It hurts. How can it not hurt? The scariest thing in life is not death, but to experience death twice." Mo Jingshan lowered his head to look at the blood-soaked little woman in his arms. His voice was hoarse and angry. "Jean Wan, open your eyes. You have to hold on for me. Open your eyes and look at me. Do you hear me? Open your eyes." Jean Wan's eyelids fluttered, and her weak hand was forcibly pressed against his face. But her fingers were weak and didn't move. Wan. She closed her eyes and didn't move anymore. The frown between her brows gradually loosened, as if her consciousness was draining away bit by bit with the loss of blood. "Jean Wan, don't sleep. Jean Wan. Kay, hurry up." Kay looked back through the rearview mirror as he drove. Seeing Mo Jingshan and Jean Wan motionless in his arms, he wanted to speak. But when he saw Mo Jingshan's eyes, his heart skipped a beat. He had never seen Mr. Mo look at him like this. He seemed to be begging him to drive faster. Kay stepped hard on the accelerator. Fortunately, all the pedestrians and vehicles on the road had been temporarily cleared 10 minutes ago. He drove at the fastest speed ever and almost flew on the road. Ordinary hospitals couldn't save Jean Wan with such a fatal gunshot wound, so they could only go to the largest international hospital in Los Angeles, which had the best doctors, medical means, and equipment. Many years ago, Nan Hung was shot several times and was on the verge of death. It was in that hospital that doctors saved him from the gates of hell. Now they could only pin their hopes on that hospital. If even that hospital couldn't save him, he was afraid that Jean Wan would really be in a hopeless situation now. "Wan, open your eyes and look at me." Who was talking? Jean Wan's consciousness was in a state of chaos. Vaguely, she seemed to hear someone's voice. Someone was calling her, but the voice was very empty, as if it came from a place far, far away, but also very close. Seeing that the little woman in his arms didn't respond, Mo Jingshan clenched her hand tightly and refused to let her hand fall. He kept pressing her hand against his face, only to feel that the temperature of her hand was dropping little by little, except that the blood flowing out of her was warm. They arrived at the hospital in 15 minutes. The distance from the highway to the hospital was almost a miracle. Jean Wan was rushed into the emergency room. Seeing that Dr. Wendell, who had saved many lives in 11 Base, had put on a sterilized suit and walked into the emergency room, Kay stood outside and let out a long breath. When he looked back, he saw Mo Jingshan standing there, covered with Jean Wan's blood. Many people around were shocked and thought he was injured. Otherwise, how could there be so much blood on his body? Mr. Mo. Kay walked over. He used to be in awe and admiration of Mr. Mo, so he often spoke to him carefully, but now it was not because he was careful but because he really didn't know how to speak to him. "The best doctors in the United States are here. Mrs. Mo will be able to hold on." Kay was a little speechless. Even he knew how uncertain his words were. After all, Jean Wan was shot in the back of the spine near the back of the neck, which was really too dangerous. If the shot was a little more accurate, she would have died on the spot. From the blood that kept gushing out of Jean Wan's mouth, He knew that her internal organs were definitely badly injured, not to mention that she was also injured. It was because Mo Jingshin knew the position of Jin Wan's wound that he knew better than anyone how dangerous she was now. Mo Jingshin didn't speak, but kept looking at the light on the door of the emergency room. Half of his body, soaked by Jin Wan's blood, was so numb that he couldn't move. He just stood still and looked at the door in front of him, as if Jin Wan would disappear in the next moment. His dark, blood-stained eyes kept staring in that direction. Kay stood beside him and wanted to speak, but when he saw Mr. Mo's expression, he couldn't say anything. Chapter 688. At 1 o'clock in the morning. It had been 5 hours since Jin Wan was sent to the emergency room. 5 hours had passed, and the medical staff still hadn't come out. The light in the emergency room had been on for 5 hours, which meant that the emergency treatment was not over, but it also meant that Jin Wan had at least survived these 5 hours. Time passed little by little. Nan Heng had killed some of Atuda's men. After tracking Atuda for several hours, he finally caught him and rushed to the hospital without giving him any time to breathe. When he arrived at the hospital, he saw the empty emergency hall, the medical staff who didn't even dare to speak loudly, and the patients and their families coming and going. He walked further inside and came to the door of the innermost emergency operating room, only to see Mo Jingshin sitting on the bench covered in blood. The blood on Mo Jingshin's shirt and trousers had dried, and the blood on his face and hands had darkened, but he didn't wipe it off at all. The man who always had a sense of propriety and was calm and intelligent was like a lost wanderer at this moment. His eyes were dark and devoid of any expression, as if they could suck people in. He sat there motionlessly, so quiet that it was scary. Nan Heng wanted to say something. After all, it was Jin Wan who was lying in the operating room, but seeing Mo Jingshin like this, he could only stand not far away and frown for a long time without approaching him. "Boss." Kay came up behind him and said in a low voice, "Mrs. Mo's wound doesn't look good. It's in this part." With that, Kay raised his hand and put it on Nan Heng's spine. "Here?" Nan Heng furrowed his brows. "Damn it, Atuda is such a bastard." It was Mrs. Mo who suddenly took the bullet for Mr. Mo. Kay said in a low voice, "Don't mention Atuda and those people in front of him now. Otherwise, if anything happens to Mrs. Mo, I'm afraid Mr. Mo will kill them." "Do you think he hasn't killed them?" Nan Heng said coldly. "Did you forget who gave Dali the fatal shot in the forehead 3 years ago in Cambodia? At that time, it was also because of Jin Wan that he had broken the oath he had made in front of Elder Mo to not stain his hands with blood. Do you think Atuda will have a good time this time? I'm afraid that even if I'm cut to death by 1,000 cuts, it won't be enough to dispel the hatred in my heart." Kay didn't speak again but looked worriedly at the light on the emergency room. "Have you informed Chin's sighting?" "Yes, Dr. Chin had an operation a few hours ago. After that, he booked a direct flight to Los Angeles. He should arrive tomorrow morning. I also informed Fengling." Hearing Fengling's name, Nan Heng paused and suddenly glanced at him. Kay hurriedly looked away and didn't speak. If it were any other reason, Fengling wouldn't go back to Los Angeles at all, but now Jin Wan's life was at stake. She would definitely come back. Nan Heng turned to look at Mo Jingshin. After a while, he frowned, took out a pack of cigarettes, and turned to walk out of the hospital. He smoked for a long time outside the hospital before returning with the smell of smoke on his body. He saw that Mo Jingshin was still sitting there in the same posture. He walked over and threw half a pack of cigarettes to him. Mo Jingshin didn't take it and the pack of cigarettes fell to the ground along his blood-stained trousers. Nan Heng looked at him and narrowed his eyes coldly. "I've known you for so many years, and today I finally see you lose your cool. But what's the use of suffering? When the brothers in 11 Base went on missions, they all died one after another. It's said that men shouldn't cry, but how many times have my eyes turned red and how many times have I hated? But no matter how much I hate, everyone is just flesh and blood. There are no miracles in this world. If you can keep them, you should keep them. If you can't, even if you poke a hole in the sky, they will still leave. We both came back from the gates of hell." Jinwan was destined to be entangled with you since she fished you out of the Los Angeles River when she was a teenager. Even if her life should have been stable and peaceful, who told her to meet you? I think she has already accepted what she should and shouldn't bear. If she doesn't love you to a certain extent, no one would have the courage to block a bullet. It can be seen that in the years you've been apart, her feelings for you have not diminished. Back then, when you watched Mr. Zand bring her to London, I saw that you were very calm. Now, you, Mo Jingshan, are finally willing to admit that you also feel pain? Mo Jingshan slowly closed his eyes and still sat there. Nan Heng sat on the opposite bench and looked at the light in the emergency room. After a while, he said, "Since she can hold on for so long after being sent to the hospital, maybe she can hold on for a little longer, 1 or 2 more days. As long as she can hold on for a certain period of time, she may still be saved. If she is shot in that position, she will be killed with 1 shot. Maybe she was shot a little bit too far away, but this little bit may be her only chance of survival. At this time, I don't have any words of comfort or coax her, but I believe Jinwan won't leave so easily, and she won't be willing to leave so easily." Mo Jingshan opened his eyes and looked at his hand hanging between his legs with his dark eyes and the blood on it that had darkened a lot. His ears were filled with Jinwan's voice when she spoke with blood in her mouth. "Only you will be willing to endure everything for me. Do you think only you can love? Do you think only you can love?" These words kept echoing in his mind. Mo Jingshan's brain was buzzing. He slowly raised his hand mechanically and looked at the blood on it. "Thank you for loving me, in both my previous and current lives. Thank you for not really giving up on me. Thank you for still wanting me." She could say these words, which showed how careful and uneasy she was in love with him. How afraid she was that he would leave in a fit of anger and never come back for 10 years, and how afraid she would be separated by death as soon as she turned around. On the surface, she looked so tough that she didn't feel anything, but when he pushed her away step by step and told her that he was already dead just to let her go, the expression on her face was deeply imprinted in his mind and he couldn't forget it. She had been afraid, but he had pushed her so far away when she was at her most apprehensive and afraid. In order to keep him, she even abandoned her dignity and desperately hugged and held him. But in the end, he still pushed her away. He remembered that when she signed the divorce agreement, she didn't even plan to see him for the last time and directly went to England. He remembered that she fell into his arms with blood in her mouth and said that she never stopped loving him. He remembered that she said in a very low voice that it hurt in his arms. Yes, it hurt. Chapter 689. It was far more than 5 hours. The light in front of the emergency room was on until the next morning. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Qin Sighting, who flew over overnight, arrived, but Jinwan still hadn't come out of the emergency room. How long has she been in there? Qin Sighting had learned about the situation from Kay before he came, so he didn't ask anything. Seeing that the emergency operation was still ongoing, he asked this question. Nan Heng held a cigarette in his hand but didn't smoke it. He just sat here and waited all night. Then he looked at Qin Sighting and said flatly, "It's been more than 12 hours. Qin Sighting didn't know whether he was relieved or not. He just nodded and said, "When I saved your life in Los Angeles with Dr. Wendell was very skilled in removing bullets from dangerous parts. At that time, I just cooperated with him in the operating room. Now, even without me, I believe Dr. Wendell is able to save Jinwan. After all, it's been so long, and she hasn't given up. Let's wait a little longer. Am I the one in a hurry now?" Nan Heng pointed with his chin in the direction of the stone on the bench outside the emergency room. Qin Sighting looked at Mo Jingshan, walked over, and looked at him condescendingly. "Every dog has its day. When Jinwan had a miscarriage, she waited outside aimlessly every day for you to wake up. That kind of anxiety and fear must be similar to this, isn't it? Or more painful than you are now." In just one night, Mo Jingshan's chin was already covered in green stubble. His body was covered in dried blood, and he looked like this. Even Qin Sighting could barely recognize him. After all, Mo Jingshan was his brother. No matter how much Qin Sighting hated him in this situation, it was useless for him to say anything except to stimulate him and keep him from collapsing. Just then, the light on the door of the emergency room finally turned from red to green. Qin Sighting was most sensitive to the change of light in the emergency room. After all, he knew the meaning of this light too well. He quickly glanced at the light on the door and suddenly said, "She should have survived." Mo Jingshan immediately turned to look at the door of the emergency room. Seeing the color of the light on the door, he got up and walked over quickly. Not long after, the door was opened, and the most skilled doctors of Los Angeles Hospital and Dr. Wendell came out. After more than 12 hours of emergency treatment, the doctors were all tired, but Dr. Wendell was still very energetic and seemed to be in a good mood, which meant that Jin Wan didn't die on his operating table. But Jin Wan was not pushed out. Only the medical staff in the operating room came out. The moment he saw Mo Jingshan, Dr. Wendell nodded to him politely and saw several acquaintances outside. He immediately took off his medical mask and said in English, "Miss G's bullet has been successfully removed, but the bullet injured the central nervous system of her spine, and she must have suffered some impact injuries before. There are several red swollen and broken skin on her head, and she suffered several cardiac arrests during the operation. Took us a lot of effort to pull her heartbeat back, but it's still very weak. We have transferred her directly from the operating room to the ICU. No one is allowed to approach her except the medical staff. The observation period and critical period will be long. Everything depends on Miss G's own ability to recover. Although the operation is very successful, whether she can survive or not really depends on her, and we can't guarantee it." Dr. Wendell nodded to Mo Jingshan politely and saw several acquaintances outside. He immediately took off his medical mask and said in English, "The bullet has been successfully removed from Miss G's body, but the bullet injured the central nervous system of her spine. Has she been transferred to the ICU?" Mo Jingshan asked, his voice almost hoarse when he spoke. Dr. Wendell nodded. "Her internal organs and spine have been injured by the bullet. She must be transferred directly from here to a sterile environment. Otherwise, her internal organs will be easily infected. Mr. Mo, please rest assured. As long as your wife still has a chance of survival, we will not give up. The most professional doctors will take care of her 24 hours a day." The central nervous system of her head and spine was injured, Qin Sighting asked calmly. "Will it affect the functions of her brain, including her brain, thinking, intelligence, etc.?" Dr. Wendell said lightly, "It's not certain yet. We need to observe her after she passes the critical period. Dr. Qin, you should know very well that Miss G was injured in a very dangerous position. It's not easy for her to survive such a long time. As for the rest, we can only observe her slowly." Qin Sighting nodded and said no more. "Mr. Mo, I'm going to change my clothes first. It's very uncomfortable to wear this for more than 10 hours in the sterile operating room. I'll tell you more about Miss G's condition after I change my clothes," Wendell said politely and respectfully to Mo Jingshan. After Mo Jingshan silently nodded, he left with the other doctors to change clothes. The lights in the emergency room then went off. Hearing that Jin Wan's life was saved, Nanheng turned to tell Kay about Atuda. Qin Sighting stood there with his hands in his trouser pockets and turned to look at Mo Jingshan, who frowned because he didn't see Jin Wan come out unscathed. "Just like your car accident, the central nervous system of her spine was injured. Did she save your life?" Mo Jingshan's eyes were distant. He just listened and said nothing. Nanheng had been waiting for Feng Ling to show up, but she didn't come to the hospital. 11 Base made several calls in a row. They had to go back to deal with Atuda, and they couldn't delay any longer. They had received accurate news that Feng Ling landed in Los Angeles almost at the same time as Qin Sighting this morning. But she didn't show up. Urged by the base again, Nanheng left. However, less than 5 minutes after Nanheng left the hospital, a slender figure in a black dress appeared in front of the hospital. Seeing that Nanheng had left, she entered the hospital. Kay had just received a call and was about to come out, when he suddenly saw a woman with shoulder-length hair, dressed very feminine and wearing sunglasses coming in. He didn't pay much attention to her. After all, There were many beautiful women in Los Angeles, and there were many such enchanting and charming women. However, at the moment when he passed by the woman, he suddenly paused and turned stiffly as though he had been struck by lightning. He looked at the back of the woman, who was somewhat strange but could not be more familiar, and said in surprise, "Feng Ling?" Chapter 690. Damn it, from the time Feng Ling sneaked into their 11 base at the age of 13 until now, they had been through life and death together. After more than 10 years, even if they later found out that Feng Ling was a F***king woman, they couldn't be more surprised than now. When had he ever seen Feng Ling so feminine? Was she really Feng Ling? 2 years ago, Feng Ling's hair had grown out a little, but it was still neatly trimmed to her ears. Although she looked like a woman, it didn't look so strange. But now Feng Ling her hair was shoulder length. Although it was still black and hadn't been permed or dyed, the length and her simple yet elegant appearance really made Kay's jaw drop. Oh my God! He was used to seeing her like a tomboy. He only knew that her skin was very fair and her facial features were very beautiful. But now he knew that the national treasure of their base was actually so beautiful. Thinking of the time when he went on a mission with her, he had to lie in a dark ditch with her for a whole night because of his injury. Kay swallowed hard. Boss Nanheng really had sharp eyes. He had taken her down long ago. Otherwise, when the brothers in the base saw Feng Ling like this, they would all pounce on her like wolves and tigers. But now, with Boss's name in the way, who the hell dared to touch her? "Kay, how is Mrs. Mo? Has she been saved?" Feng Ling only took a look at him. Seeing the surprised expression in Kay's eyes, she didn't explain much and just asked indifferently. Kay finally came back to his senses and was stunned for a few seconds before he said, "Ah, yes, she was saved. But she was directly sent to the ICU. The bullet was in the spine, and the doctor said it hurt the spinal nerve. In short, it's very dangerous. Although the bullet was successfully removed, I don't know if she can survive." Feng Ling's eyes, which had a greeting smile, suddenly darkened. "I see. I'll go to see her." "You can't see her. Now Mr. Mo can't even get close to the ICU. There are several isolation areas outside the sterile ward of this hospital. We can't get close to them, and the brothers here can only guard outside those isolation areas." Feng Ling nodded and did not say more. She turned and walked in. Kay opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but when the words were on the tip of his tongue, he remembered that Boss Nanheng had just left. She didn't show up until he left. Obviously, she didn't want to see him. It seemed that there was no need for him to say this. Otherwise, it would easily provoke her to leave again. For such a long time, Boss Nanheng had already suffered enough. If he saw Feng Ling dressed like this, it was likely that many men would fall in love with her. Boss Nanheng was afraid that he would go crazy. The ICU was separated by several isolation areas. Mo Jingshan was repeatedly provoked and persuaded by Qin Sighting. He reluctantly allowed a nurse to come over and wipe the dried blood off his face and hands with alcohol cotton. He then sat outside the isolation area, which was the closest to the ICU, still as petrified as a statue. "I say, even if you sit here and wait, you can only resign yourself to fate and rely on her to support herself. Are you sure you don't want to deal with your appearance and clothes?" Seeing Mo Jingshan like this, Qin Sighting secretly felt happy for Jin Wan at first, but now he sighed softly. Mo Jingshan closed his eyes. "It's okay. I'll stay here with her." Qin Sighting sat on the same bench and looked at the direction of the ICU, which was so far away that he could barely see it. "I trust Dr. Wendell's medical skills. In the whole world, he is the only doctor I can trust. Since he could take out the bullet safely and didn't hurt her, I think he sent her to the sterile ward so cautiously because he wanted to continue treating her. If there was no hope, he wouldn't spend so much effort. You know, Dr. Wendell has a temper. If it's a hopeless patient, he won't even accept her." At this time, the sound of high heels approached. Qin Sighting raised his head, took a look, and then withdrew his gaze. Then he paused and jerked his eyes back to look at the person. When he saw Feng Ling's face, Qin Sighting raised his eyebrows. "Did Nanheng see you like this?" Mo Jingshan also glanced in Feng Ling's direction. His gaze was indifferent and emotionless. But it was clear that no one expected Feng Ling to appear here, not to mention that she had completely changed. Feng Ling automatically blocked out the word Nan Heng. When she walked over, she took a look inside, looked at Mo Jingshan, and greeted him respectfully as usual. Mr. Mo Jingshan nodded imperceptibly and still didn't speak. He was a man of few words. Ever since Jin Wan was shot, he had become much quieter. Feng Ling turned to Qin Sighting and nodded. Dr. Qin. Qin Sighting raised his eyebrows and smiled. Very beautiful, Miss Feng. He said the word, Miss Feng, meaningfully. Obviously, he was teasing her. Feng Ling didn't get angry. She just smiled and nodded at him again. Not only did the handsome young man suddenly become a woman, but she was also so beautiful. When Qin Sighting thought of how colorful Nan Heng's face would be if he saw Feng Ling dressed like this, he found it even more amusing. But after all, Jin Wan was still in danger, and he really couldn't laugh, so he just said, "You specially came back for Jin Wan's matter? Except for the brothers in 11 base, you don't have any friends, and Jin Wan is one of them. If it weren't for her, would you have never set foot in Los Angeles again?" Feng Ling smiled frankly. Why do I have to go back to Los Angeles? After leaving 11 base, I'm no longer a member of their base. When I return to the place where I belong, I'm no longer the Feng Ling I used to be. Indeed, if it weren't for Jin Wan, I wouldn't be standing here anymore. You're really ruthless. Qin Sighting sneered. Are all you women like this? As long as you don't look back, even if a man kneels down to beg you, you won't feel anything? Feng Ling glanced at him and asked, Does Dr. Qin look like a man who will kneel to a woman? Or does Nan Heng look like the kind of man who will kneel to a woman? Qin Sighting. Chapter 691. What's going on? Feng Ling asked abruptly when she saw the back of the medical staff in a hurry. Qin Sighting's voice was calm. Do you think people can just sleep in the ICU? They may face cardiac arrest or near death at any time. Jin Wan's life is not easy. This kind of emergency rescue will happen from time to time in the next few days. You have to get used to it. Hearing this, Feng Ling didn't show much expression on her face, but she couldn't help looking inside. She turned back to look at Mo Jingshan, only to see that the man's gaze never left the ICU. His gaze did not move. Half an hour later, the emergency medical staff all came out. They looked relieved, which meant that Jin Wan had survived another crisis. Men often think women are fragile, but in fact, everyone is equal in the face of life. Even women's willpower is stronger than men's in many cases, Feng Ling said. I learned this when I went to London to accompany Jin Wan for a year. She has a tenacity in her nature that others can't see, so she will definitely hold on. Mo Jingshan glanced out of the window of the ICU and then looked back at Feng Ling. His eyes were dark, but he immediately understood. After 3 days of life-threatening danger, Dr. Wendell walked out of the ICU on the third night, only to see Mo Jingshan, who had barely slept in the hospital for 3 days and hadn't even changed his clothes. After all, they had met many times and known each other for many years. He had never seen Mr. Mo so depressed, ignoring everything and waiting for a woman to wake up. Dr. Wendell said, Many of Miss G's vital signs have gradually recovered, but she still needs to be observed in the ICU for a few more days. She has survived the critical period. As long as she can maintain this good state, she will be completely saved in a few days. Hearing Dr. Wendell's words, Mo Jingshan's expression, which had been cold for 3 days, finally showed signs of softening. Qin Sighting nodded to Dr. Wendell. Thank you for your hard work. I finally heard good news. Dr. Wendell also smiled. Yes, Miss G is very tenacious. Every time her heart stopped and she was on the verge of death, she could be saved. After every treatment, I can feel that she consciously wants to wake up. At times like this, willpower is still very important. Qin Sighting nodded. Dr. Wendell looked at Mo Jingshan. Mr. Mo, you'd better clean yourself up. If you continue like this, I'm afraid you won't be able to hold on before Miss G wakes up. Mo Jingshan didn't speak but looked at Dr. Wendell gratefully. Thank you. It was almost another day and night without speaking. Even when Mo Jingshan spoke, his voice was hoarse. Did you hear that? Jin Wan is still holding on. It's rare for you to be dispirited in your life. You haven't shaved or changed your clothes for 3 or 4 days. If Jin Wan sees you like this, she'll probably be scared to death again. Qin Sighting said as he walked over and reached out to pull Mo Jingshan up. Perhaps because Mo Jingshan hadn't moved for 3 days and had only eaten a few bites of the food they bought. The moment he was pulled up by Qin Sighting, his tall and straight body swayed. Qin Sighting hurriedly supported him, frowning. You've been suffering for 3 days. Can you still hold on? Before Mo Jingshan spoke, Dr. Wendell received Qin Sighting's gaze and immediately asked 2 nurses who came over to open the door of the nearest ward and asked Qin Sighting to help Mo Jingshan in to rest. Maybe because of the rare good news about Jin Wan, Mo Jingshan was no longer so cold and depressed that no one dared to approach him, or maybe only Qin Sighting dared to drag Mo Jingshan away by force. He sent Mo Jingshan to a nearby ward and asked Kay to bring him a change of clothes and other things. He hadn't eaten much for 3 days. Qin Sighting gave him a bottle of glucose, pushed him into the simple bathroom in the ward, and threw a change of clothes into it. It wasn't until Mo Jingshan took a shower, cleaned the stubble around his chin, and changed his clothes that Qin Sighting felt a little comfortable. Tut, how could I forget? I should have taken more photos of you with my cell phone before I let you take a shower. I'll show them to Jin Wan when she wakes up. I want her to know that the great Mo Jingshan can have such an unbearable day. Qin Sighting said with a smile, and then said, You haven't slept for 3 days. You can't stand it at all. You should take a rest, even if it's just a 2-hour nap. Mo Jingshan took a look at him and said coldly, What did you put in the bottle of glucose you gave me just now? Qin Sighting smiled. The drug works so fast? I specially asked Dr. Wendell for the nearest tranquilizer and dissolved it in the glucose. It should take you a while to fall asleep, but you haven't eaten or drunk anything these days. I guess your body's resistance has weakened, so the drug works faster than usual. There's nothing to say. Just go to sleep. Hearing that Qin Sighting dared to add a tranquilizer to the glucose he injected, Mo Jingshan sighed coldly and rubbed between his eyebrows. Qin Sighting had been brothers for so many years, so he knew Mo Jingshan well. He knew the heartache behind Mo Jingshan's indifference. In the end, Mo Jingshan couldn't resist the tranquilizer he got from Dr. Wendell. Seeing that he could finally close his eyes for a while, Qin Sighting got up and went out. Mo Jingshan slept for an entire night. He did not put much tranquilizer in the glucose, but it allowed him to sleep without relying on the drug for most of the time. However, early the next morning, Mo Jingshan opened his eyes and got up to walk out of the ward. Although he didn't see anything strange, he was still keenly aware that the mood of the people outside was not right. What happened? Mo Jingshan's indifferent handsome face was no longer as dejected as a few days ago, but because of the atmosphere, it was so cold that people didn't dare to look at him. When the people of 11 Base saw Mo Jingshan, their faces all darkened. One of them said, Last night, some of Atuda's men sneaked into the hospital, kidnapped the medical staff on other floors, disguised as medical staff, and took Mrs. Mo away from the ward. The isolation area was too long and we couldn't get close. When we found them, they had disappeared. Dr. Qin immediately took people to chase them, but there is still no news. Chapter 692. Mo Jingshan went inside in extreme anger. Sure enough, he saw that most of the medical staff were injured, and many of them were suddenly attacked from behind and unconscious while on duty. All the medical equipment in the ICU where Jin Wan stayed had been cut off, and there was no one on the bed. It was too far away for non-hospital staff to approach. Qin Sighting was guarding outside after he fell asleep last night. Even if he was here, he wouldn't be able to tell whether those people were real medical staff or other people who had sneaked in. By the time he found out, Jin Wan would have been transferred away. Suddenly, Mo Jingshan's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen with cold eyes. It was Qin Sighting's number. The moment he picked up the phone, Qin Sighting said coldly, I found them. Our men have surrounded them outside, But Jinwan's life is in their hands. They ask you to go there in person. Their purpose is clear. Even if they can't exchange Jinwan for a tuta, they want to get what they want from you. They are just using the reason of exchanging a tuta as an excuse. In fact, they want to take the opportunity to monopolize her. I'll go there. Mo Jingshin hung up the phone expressionlessly, turned around, and walked out. The large hotel room was silent and deserted. Several Cambodians surrounded the pale woman on the bed. She had not woken up since they stole her out of the ICU a few hours ago. They even wondered if they had stolen a dead person. Could she threaten Mo Jingshin? But after all, they heard that this woman named Jinwan was Mo Jingshin's only weakness. If they took her out of the ICU, she must be a threat to him. Will she die here? One of the shorties looked at the woman on the bed and felt that she looked no different from a dead person. She didn't react at all. Even if she dies, Control will find a way to bring her back intact. Just wait patiently. He will be here soon. We are surrounded by 11 base. Isn't it too dangerous to do this? Brother hasn't been rescued yet. Shall we exchange brother's life for his? What do you mean exchange? As long as we get what we want from Control, the money will be ours. Big Brother has been in their hands for so many days. Even if he's not dead, he'll be crippled. Even if we save him, he won't be able to protect us. Let's ignore him and do this ourselves. At this time, one of them put his hand between the nose of the woman on the bed. After a while, he said nervously, "She's breathing is very weak. If we steal her out like this and she dies here, will Control kill us all at once? For example, blow up this building? His woman is in our hands, so the building won't explode. We've already stolen her, so what's there to be afraid of?" Just as they were discussing what to do next, Mo Jingshin had already arrived at Qin's sightings location. They're up there, and they're threatening you with Mrs. Mo's life. If you don't come in person, they'll throw Mrs. Mo down from the balcony of the top floor. Kay, who had come with Qin's sighting, came over and said, "Mr. Mo, these people aren't very loyal to Atuda and they've been scheming against him for a long time. In my opinion, it's easier to deal with such mercenary people than those who are too loyal and inflexible. Be careful. We'll follow them." Those people asked Mo Jingshin to go up in person and not to carry a gun. Standing on the quiet and luxurious corridor carpet of the hotel, Mo Jingshin stretched out his arms expressionlessly and allowed the two Cambodians to search him. After making sure he didn't carry a gun, they allowed him to enter the elevator. Until the top floor of the hotel, the man walked out of the elevator. His tall and straight figure emitted a cold aura like a thin blade. He glanced at the room in front of him and the few people guarding outside the door. He walked over with a cold expression. His voice seemed to overflow from his throat, and his tone was cold and mocking. "A few traitors who want to occupy the mountain and become kings. Their ambitions are really great. How dare they kidnap my people?" The guards outside the room didn't speak English very well and didn't understand Chinese very well. Seeing Mo Jingshin come up alone, they froze for a moment and then quickly put on a cold face and said in Cambodian, "Mr. Control, we're negotiating with you with your woman's life. It's not so easy for you to enter this door. You'd better think it over. Do you want her life or the underground wealth that you don't even care about? Anyway, you don't want those things. You might as well give them to us." They weren't sure if Mo Jingshin could understand them. When they were hesitating about how to communicate with him, Mo Jingshin said flatly, "Tell your current leader to come out." He was speaking in Cambodian. Those people paused. They had heard from Atuda that Mr. Control was very difficult to deal with, whether in terms of intelligence, means, or other aspects. Many of his accomplices had suffered a lot in the hands of him and 11 Base many years ago, but they didn't expect that he was proficient in so many languages. One of them calmed down and repeated in a threatening tone, "Mr. Control, our current leader was once the most powerful elite under Atuda's command. He said that as long as you give us what we want, he will let your woman go safely." When those people came up to him threateningly, Mo Jingshin took half a step back. It seemed that he was retreating cautiously, but when those people approached him and were about to grab him, he raised his hand and grabbed one of them by the throat, smiling coldly. You good-for-nothings want to threaten me? If my woman loses even a hair here, I'm afraid the situation will get out of control. I can't guarantee that I won't kill. Before he could finish his sentence, the atmosphere was so tense that it was about to collapse in the next second. In less than half a second, a few people beside him raised their guns and were about to point at him. However, the man in front of them had a cold look in his eyes. His black eyes flashed, and suddenly, his aura was so sharp that it was frightening, so dangerous that it caught them off guard. When they came to themselves, Mo Jingshan's gun had been aimed at one of their eyebrows. The man who was grabbed by the throat suddenly turned pale and looked at the man who was pointing a gun at him. Mo Jingshan took the gun from him so fast that he didn't notice it at all. This man, who was respectfully called Mr. Control in their circle, was the think tank of 11 Base and one of the mysterious bosses behind it, but few people had seen him fight in person. They didn't expect that he was so good at fighting. Mo Jingshan's eyes were cold. Dressed in a black shirt and trousers, he said coldly, "Let him go." Chapter 693. The man held hostage by Mo Jingshan turned livid and pale. His throat was strangled and he couldn't speak, nor could he escape. Seeing that the others clearly did not intend to care about this person's life and only raised their guns to point at Mo Jingshan, their eyes were filled with wariness. However, because they wanted to get what they wanted from him, they could not directly kill him with one shot. In this moment of stalemate, these people were full of hesitation, worry, and panic. Mo Jingshan was the opposite. A string of crystal lamps on the ceiling of the hotel corridor was accurately shot through by a bullet, and various crystal glass lamps were smashed and fell to the ground with a clatter. There were only 2 windows at the ends of the corridor on the left and right sides, and the middle section was plunged into darkness because all the lights went out. The first person to rush out of the door of the safe passage was K, because it was 11 Base's unchanging code to fire a shot after snatching a gun. The moment he heard the gunshot, he rushed out as fast as he could, followed by other base members who quietly climbed to the top floor along the stairs of the safe passage. The light in the corridor was too dim. Before those Cambodians realized what was going on, they were suddenly knocked down, and their guns and everything that could be used as weapons were taken away in an instant. However, everything happened very quietly. Except for the first shot that Mo Jingshan fired, all the subsequent actions were silent. Even those people who were knocked down fell to the ground in an instant and couldn't make a sound. The man held by Mo Jingshan was the only one who hadn't been knocked down. After gradually adapting to the dark light, he saw the scene around him and the people of 11 Base. His face changed dramatically, and he immediately wanted to shout to warn those people who were holding Jin Wan hostage in the room. Just when he was about to speak, the man holding the gun in front of him was still calm, pointing the muzzle between his eyebrows as if he was not threatened at all. Mo Jingshan's face remained unchanged, and he still said 2 words coldly, "Open the door." The man looked at him and moved his lips, but he didn't dare to make a sound because the gun was pointed at his head. He was about to beg for mercy when the door behind him opened. Although there was no sound after that, their guns were not silenced, and the people inside must have heard the sound when Mo Jingshan fired. It was just that they couldn't guess whether the gun was fired by their men or someone else. After all, if Mo Jingshan could really enter this hotel, he should have been searched and couldn't have brought a gun in. But the people who came out didn't expect that when the door opened, they would see more than 20 people of 11 Base standing in a row in the dark, and all the guns were aimed in the direction of the door. The man's expression changed, and his pupils constricted. Just as he was about to retreat, he stopped in front of the door in fright because of the muzzles of the guns. There was a moment of dead silence in the corridor. From the beginning to the end, Mo Jingshan remained calm and indifferent. The people in front of the door saw Mo Jingshan in the darkness and then saw their brothers lying unconscious on the ground. One of them was being held hostage by Mo Jingshan. They abruptly turned around and rushed back. At the moment when the man moved, Kay took the lead to shoot. With a bang, the man was shot in the shoulder. The people in the room were ready to go, and the leader had already dragged Ji Nwan up from the bed. At the moment when Kay rushed in with his men, He saw several people carrying Jin Wan on their shoulders, standing on the balcony, and pointing their guns at the door. They were few in number and might not have enough bullets, but their biggest trump card was Jin Wan. Seeing Jin Wan, who hadn't passed the critical period, being carried on their shoulders and left the hospital, they didn't know if she could survive this. Kay glared at them coldly and pointed the gun in his hand at the head of the man who was carrying Jin Wan. The Los Angeles police and the members of 11 Base have completely surrounded the hotel. If you don't want to make things worse, let them go immediately. The man behind Kay said, "I'll give you the last 30 seconds. The leader who was carrying Jin Wan sneered and suddenly looked back at the balcony, only to see that the Los Angeles rescue team had arrived at the balcony, and a huge air cushion as high as 2 stories had been laid down below. Even if they threatened them by throwing this woman down, there was no room for them to threaten them. Even if they jumped down now, even if they didn't die, they would be instantly held down by the people who surrounded them below." The expressions of these people were instantly filled with panic, full of surprise. They had been with Atuda in war-torn countries for many years, and the rescue teams of those countries would never come to rescue them in time. They were not familiar with Los Angeles, so they usually followed Atuda and listened to his decisions. They didn't expect that when they wanted to do a big job, they would miscalculate so much. Did this Mr. Control know that they would make a mistake? Kay was about to go up, but in a flash, the gun suddenly changed direction and stuck directly to Jin Wan's body. The members of 11 Base were not weak. They were even better trained than many members of the American Special Forces and had excellent martial arts skills. As long as it was a normal fight, they would not be at a disadvantage. But now Mrs. Mo was in the hands of these Cambodians, and more importantly, Mrs. Mo's health was not very good. She had been saved in the hospital, so they couldn't make any mistakes, so they couldn't do their best. But even at this point, the people of 11 Base didn't seem to be at a disadvantage at all. Just when those people had been cautiously staring at Kay, fearing that they would be threatened and were going to attack them, Mo Jingshin hit the ribs of the man he was holding with a clever force. As the man bent over in pain, Mo Jingshin kicked him forward. Hearing the noise, Kay looked back and saw this scene. At the same time, he raised his foot and kicked the man forward again. This man was too dark, thin and short. After being kicked twice, he almost flew to the balcony not far away and finally fell heavily at the feet of those people, spitting out blood from his mouth. Chapter 694. Don't come any closer, or we'll kill her now. He wanted her to take her last breath right here. Even if we die, we can take Mr. Control's beloved wife with us. The leader of the men on the balcony pressed the muzzle against Jin Wan's back. As if on purpose, he pressed the muzzle harder and harder on the wound where Jin Wan had just taken out the bullet. Seeing the wound on Jin Wan's shoulder that had almost healed gradually oozed blood again and stained her white hospital gown, Mo Jingshin immediately stopped in his tracks. Kay and the others had already pulled the trigger of their guns. A fight could break out at any time. Looking at the men who had been leaning against the balcony with their backs to the high-rise building of another hotel across the road, Mo Jingshin looked at them coldly and suddenly let out a low, hoarse laugh. A few seconds later, he continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. The leader of the men also tightened his fingers on the trigger and watched Mr. Control come over as if he didn't care about this woman's life at all. Didn't their brother Atuda say that this woman named Jin Wan was Mr. Control's weakness? Why did Mr. Control not seem to care about her when she was injured like this and her life was still in their hands? Was it because this woman couldn't live long? Or did Mr. Control have some other plan? But looking at this man's fearless expression, and even his entire body was filled with cold disdain, it was obvious that it was different from what they had imagined. Just as they cautiously carried Jin Wan to the balcony and leaned against the balcony railing, Mo Jingshin said flatly, "You're courting death." The man's tone was too cold. So cold that they didn't understand what he meant when he suddenly said those words. However, suddenly there was a muffled bang. It was a silencer. Only those who knew how to shoot could distinguish the sudden muffled sound, but none of the people of 11 Base in the room, including Mo Jingshin, fired. It had only been 2 seconds before the men on the balcony realized what had happened. The leader of the men carrying Jinwan had been shot through the back of his head. He stood there stiffly for 2 seconds and then slowly knelt down. Even though he was dead, his eyes were still wide open and he couldn't believe what had happened. Just as those people were frightened by this sudden change, in just 2 seconds, there were a few more bang-bang sounds, and the few people standing on the balcony had their heads exploded in an instant. Seeing those men fall to the ground one by one and die with their eyes wide open in disbelief, Mo Jingshan looked calmly at the top window of the hotel across the road, where a sniper rifle was still standing. Mo Jingshan stepped forward and picked Jinwan up. Kay immediately led his men to kick those men away, lest the blood flowing from the back of their heads stained Jinwan's body. Seeing that Jinwan's complexion was so pale that it was almost colorless and that the wound on her back was seeping more blood, Mo Jingshan carried her up with a cold expression. Without a moment's delay, he quickly turned to leave. On the opposite side, Feng Ling withdrew the sniper rifle from the window and was about to carry it on her back out of habit. But then she realized that she was no longer a member of 11 Base and it was not convenient for her to take it with her. So she put the rifle aside and looked back deadpan, only to see Qin Sighting, who was looking at her calmly. No wonder when Nanhang didn't know you were a woman. He often said that although there were many capable people and powerful snipers in 11 Base, only you and Kay could shoot accurately from a distance of 500 meters, especially you. Although you are young and much thinner than others, you are more skillful with the sniper rifle than anyone else and seem to have infinite explosive power. Today, I finally understand why he praised you so much. Feng Ling said flatly. It should be said that Dr. Qin and Mr. Mo's judgment is very accurate. Those Cambodians know the current situation of 11 Base very well and know that Kay is the most trusted sniper. As long as Kay breaks into the hotel with them, they will think that 11 Base is in a hurry this time and doesn't prepare an external sniper range, so this diversion is the key to victory. Qin Sighting smiled. You haven't touched a gun for nearly a year, have you? Feng Ling raised her eyebrows lightly. I haven't touched a gun since I left the base, so I'm really out of practice. If it weren't for the fact that the person I'm going to save today is Jinwan, I wouldn't have taken this risk so easily. If I didn't aim accurately, I would have killed more than her. Since Nanhang asked me to call you here, of course, I trust your marksmanship. Feng Ling said flatly. Did Nanhang ask you to call me? Qin Sighting raised his eyebrows with a smile. Of course. Otherwise, why do you think I dare to invite you, Miss Feng? Since he is in Los Angeles, why didn't he come in person? Speaking of marksmanship, Kay and I were both personally trained by him. Isn't he the safest sniper? Feng Ling looked a little unfriendly. What do you think? Feng Ling didn't say anything more. She just put the sniper rifle back into the black rectangular leather case, and then turned to walk out expressionlessly, not intending to stay any longer. Feng Ling, Nanhang forced you to leave 11 Base for your own good. You grew up in an orphanage and finally found your family, so you should go back to live a peaceful life. Besides, your family won't allow you to live such a dangerous life again. He owes the Feng family a favor, but you are the lost child of the Feng family, so he can't negotiate with the Feng family and can only ask you to go back. Even if it's for your own good, he has to do that. Feng Ling didn't seem to hear his words. She didn't stop but walked out without looking back. However, as soon as she walked out of the door, she suddenly saw a tall and straight figure standing outside. The man was just outside the door, his back against the wall, a cigarette in his hand flickering between his fingers. Because she came out, he looked sideways at her. The man half-narrowed his dark eyes in the smoke, stared at her cold face, and then took a deep breath, blowing the smoke on her face. Feng Ling looked coldly at Nanhang, who had been waiting outside for a long time. Chapter 695. Nanhang was nearly 1.9 meters tall and Feng Ling was nearly 1.7 meters tall. The difference between them was about 10 or 20 centimeters. When he looked down at her from above, he could clearly see each of her eyelashes. At this time, because she saw him, her eyelashes seemed to be frozen bit by bit, without any warmth. Even though she had been separated for 10 months and her appearance had been crowned with the shell of the eldest daughter of the Feng family, she was still the same Feng Ling, lonely and indifferent. His heart skipped a beat. It was a little sore and painful, but he couldn't describe the feeling. Nan Hung threw away the cigarette but in his hand and stepped on it to extinguish it. Just as he was about to reach out to hold her wrist, she evaded him without leaving a trace. At the same time, she retreated a meter away. Nan Hung looked down at her and said in a low and hoarse voice, "I haven't seen you for 10 months. Are you going to avoid me like this?" Feng Ling didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were cold. She gave up taking the elevator and turned to go straight to the safe passage in the other direction. Nan Heng's expression froze for a moment. Then he quickly followed up. Qin Sighting rushed back to the hospital and entered the emergency room with Dr. Wendell. If it had been any longer, Jin Wan would have died in that hotel. A few hours later, Jin Wan was sent back to the ICU. This time, the hospital learned from their mistake and allowed the people of 11 Base to enter the isolation area. They put on a layer of sterilized coats and guarded outside the ward. Through the glass outside the ward, Mo Jingshan looked at Jin Wan lying motionless inside. All the medical equipment damaged by those people had been replaced with new equipment. She lay there, all white, almost drowned in a pile of medical wires and instruments of various colors beside the bed. No matter how long Mo Jingshan stood there and looked at her, she remained motionless. After participating in the emergency treatment, Qin Sighting took a shower and changed his clothes. Seeing that Mo Jingshan could finally stand outside the ward and look at Jin Wan, he walked over and said, "She was seriously injured. Just a few days after the operation, she was tossed out by those people. After disinfecting and retreating the wound, I can see that her signs of life are stable, but she is still very weak. No matter what, I lost her last night. Her life is in my hands." Mo Jingshan's expression didn't change, but when he looked at Jin Wan on the bed, his eyes darkened and his voice was low and slow. "Even if I was outside last night, I wouldn't have found what happened inside. After all, the isolation area is too far away and the medical staff are wearing sterilized masks. It has nothing to do with you. Don't take responsibility." Qin Sighting also looked at Jin Wan. "Those people just want to get what they want from you, so they don't dare to do anything to you, but they are cruel to the people around you. However, they can't afford to take Jin Wan's life." Mo Jingshan stared at the motionless woman inside and said indifferently, "No matter who they are, they can't take her life." These words were light and light. Compared to the scene of Mo Jingshan barging into the hotel alone and firing a warning shot in the morning, it appeared much calmer. However, these words carried more weight. "Is Atuda still in Nan Heng's hands?" Mo Jingshan asked. "I asked Kay. He said that he is locked in the base and many people are guarding him, waiting for you to find time to go back and kill him. After all, the person who was injured is Jin Wan. They know that you have to kill this person yourself to vent their hatred. If Jin Wan doesn't wake up, even if we kill him, it won't be enough." Mo Jingshan's eyes were cold. "Where is Nan Hung?" Qin Sighting didn't answer but sighed with a smile. It's rare for Feng Ling to return to Los Angeles because of Jin Wan. Although he didn't answer the question, it was enough to let Mo Jingshan know Nan Heng's current situation. Mo Jingshan didn't speak anymore but just looked at Jin Wan through the glass. He looked at her pale face, which had lost a lot of weight in just a few days, looked at her eyelashes which hadn't moved at all, and heard what she said before the accident. She said she wanted to go back to the U Garden. In the dark detention room, someone was cursing from time to time. Sometimes it was in Cambodian, sometimes it was in English, and sometimes it was in Chinese. The curses were all the same. "Let Control come to see me. He's such a coward. Why did I let you bunch of trash lock me up here? If you dare, come to see me alone. Control. Your Chinese name is Mo Jingshan, right? Get the hell over here." After cursing for several days, Atuda didn't get any food or water. After 4 or 5 days, he had no strength to curse anymore and was on the verge of death. If he hadn't fainted once and the people of 11 Base hadn't poured cold water on him to force him to wake up and continue to be tortured, he would have been dead by now. However, the saliva was still stinky. It tasted like the feces and urine of the dogs raised in this base. The wounds on Atuda's body had already dried up. Blood and torn clothes were stuck to his body, and his yellow hair was messy on top of his head and almost tied into a knot. He was still cursing, panting weakly. Control. Don't think I'll die as easily as Akib. Of course you won't die as easily as Akib. I don't need to come here in person. The people here have thousands of ways to make you beg for death. Suddenly hearing the voice from outside, Atuda frowned and immediately looked up at the man who finally showed up outside the door. The moment he saw Mo Jingshan clearly, his brows immediately darkened. The man who rarely came back to 11 base from the hospital looked at Atuda, who was in a mess, and said in a low, hoarse, and careless voice, "You tried everything you could to get the source of the underground arms from me, just for the endless wealth. You two brothers risked your lives one after another, but you didn't hear me say anything. You don't want to give up, do you?" Atuda sneered. "Even if you don't tell us the source of those channels, I'm afraid you won't take those things. Don't you think it's a pity to hide billions of dollars worth of wealth under your silence? You've been making money in various war-torn countries and eating the food of the dead for so many years, but you haven't even made billions. Don't expect to get the money after I tell you the channel. For a good-for-nothing like you, even if I put those things in front of you, you won't be able to take the astronomical figure." The lighter Mo Jingshan's tone was, the thicker the disdain in it was. Chapter 696. After receiving a call from the hospital, Mo Jingshan left 11 base again and hurried back to the hospital. Dr. Wendell said that Jinwan was kidnapped by those Cambodians before she passed the critical period. She must have hit her head when she was taken into the car, and the head injury caused subarachnoid hemorrhage. Although it was not fatal, it was hard to predict when she would wake up. When Mo Jingshan returned to the hospital, he was wearing the same clothes as when he returned to the base, black trousers and a black t-shirt. Knowing that it was hard to predict when Jinwan would wake up, he looked decadent and dark. Apart from changing his clothes and taking a shower, he hadn't tidied himself up for a few days. His short black hair was a little messy due to the wind, but he still had a handsome face with deep facial features. He just left with a cold expression. He walked back to the ICU ward and watched the scene through the glass. Because Jinwan couldn't move anymore, the brain surgery couldn't be transferred to the operating room but was carried out directly in the ICU. Through the protective glass window, Mo Jingshan looked at Jinwan lying there coldly. She didn't even need to be anesthetized and didn't seem to feel anything during the operation. The doctors were busy operating on her. Various medical instruments beeped from time to time, and there were images of heart, breathing, blood pressure, and so on. Looking at the faint heartbeat on the image, Mo Jingshan's eyes were filled with emotion. Stepping on the cold ground, he stood straight in front of the glass. When Kay came back, he saw Mo Jingshan standing there coldly and solemnly, so he quickly walked up to him. Kay knew that Jinwan was in critical condition recently and Mr. Mo couldn't leave, so he respectfully told him what had happened to Atuda in the base. He estimated that Atuda wouldn't be able to live for more than a few days. After briefly explaining how to deal with those people related to Atuda, he didn't disturb him anymore and left. The hospital corridor outside the ICU fell silent again. Mo Jingshan looked at Jinwan, who was unconscious, slowly raised his hand and put it on the glass window. His palm gradually closed, clenched into a fist, and his knuckles turned white. 1 week later, Jinwan was still unconscious. There was an oxygen tube in her nose, and there was an injection on the back of her hand. The back of her hand, which was already riddled with holes, was pale and covered in bruises left by the needle holes. Fortunately, since this morning, Jinwan's wounds had already healed. Her internal organs that had been injured by the bullet had also recovered well. Although she was still in the ICU, she was allowed 2 hours of visitation every day. Qin Sighting walked into the ward and saw Mo Jingshan sitting by the bed, watching Jinwan in deep sleep. These days, Mo Jingshan stayed with her for as long as she slept. The vice president and his assistant were in charge of the company's internal and external affairs. She couldn't eat, and Mo Jingshan hardly ate these days. He only took a few bites when they forced him to the table. Qin Sighting came up behind him. "Your cell phone rang. I took a look. It's the Ji family in High City. I guess Jinwan hasn't been heard from these days." Ji Hongwen must have something to talk to her about. Mo Jingshan took a look at the time. I'll call him back later. Qin Sighting nodded. Jin Wan is so badly injured now. Don't tell the people in High City. Wait until her vital signs are all stabilized. Otherwise, so many people will come all the way here, especially your grandfather. He is so old. The less he knows about these things, the less he will worry about. Mo Jingshan didn't speak anymore. His eyes were still on the face of the person sleeping on the bed, motionless. He knew that Mo Jingshan's current state seemed to have nothing to do with him except for waiting for Jin Wan to wake up. Qin Sighting didn't say more. He just patted him on the shoulder and then looked at Jin Wan, who was also sleeping as if she didn't even have a dream. She was motionless and her face was so pale that she didn't look like a real person. Mo Jingshan put his hand on Jin Wan's uninjected hand and held her bruised hand firmly in his palm. Another half a month passed. Mo Jingshan had been allowed to accompany Jin Wan in her ward every day. He had been holding the woman's white, tender, and soft hand. At this time, the cell phone on the bedside vibrated. Mo Jingshan took a look at it and raised his other hand to pick up the phone. Mr. Mo, Atuda has an adoptive father in Mexico, who is the godfather of the Mexican mafia. More than 20 years ago, he was also active in war-torn countries all over the world. In recent years, most of his forces have been taken away, and the remaining men and wealth are not enough to support him, so he sent Atuda to find a way to get those underground arms channels from you so as to earn billions of dollars. Now we've found Atuda's adoptive father. He was diagnosed with liver cancer a few months ago and is lying in the hospital waiting to die. Seeing Atuda's failure, his men have all run away. There are only a dozen of them around him, but they are now under our control. He wants to call you. Do you want to answer it? Mo Jingshan said coldly, You are going to die. What else do you want to say? The other party handed the phone to Atuda's adoptive father, and then an old and weak voice rang. Mr. Control, I met you many years ago, but at that time you didn't find out who I was. I didn't expect that now my only adopted son has fallen into your hands. Mo Jingshan didn't speak. He just put Jin Wan's hand in his palm and slowly stroked it, gently stroking each of her fingers as if to warm her cold hands so that they wouldn't stay cold. Mr. Control, there is a saying in China that a mantis is trying to stop a chariot. I know this is the situation we are in now, and I'm not qualified to negotiate with you, but I have no son. Atuda is my only adopted son. He has been very loyal and filial to me for many years. I'm willing to give you the rest of my wealth as long as you let him go. Now I want to know, what have you done to my adopted son? There was a cold and frivolous sneer in Mo Jingshan's dark eyes. You should ask me what I'm going to do to you. The meaning behind his words was that he would not let them go, and that he would capture every single one of them, from top to bottom, was shockingly clear. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.